Okay, so we've been listening to some Soviet lo-fi. My name is Dan Baker. This is Comrade Meow's audiobooks, and we are going to listen to some audiobooks about Lenin in a little bit. But right now, I'm going to read What is Marxism. And a little later, we're going to practice meditation, yoga, and martial arts, and I encourage you to follow along with me this morning and every morning. I'm going to bring this in. I have a very simple setup here, very humble. Sorry about the background noise. I had them up. So, we're reading from What is Marxism by Alan Woods and Rob Sewell. Productive and unproductive labor. As we can see, the production of surplus value takes place in production and not in circulation. It is through the exploitation of the working class during the production process that profit is produced. What kind of work performed is irrelevant. Marx explains that capitalism is not interested whatsoever in the particular use values created in the production process. Whether they produce pencils, shoes, motor cars, or luxury yachts is irrelevant. They are simply means to an end for the capitalist and nothing more. The capitalists are interested only in the exchange value, and thereby the surplus value, which they realize once the commodity has been sold. The whole basis of capitalist production is the production of surplus value. Marx therefore concludes that under the profit system, only labor which produces capital is productive labor. Whether workers produce tangible things or not is also unimportant, as long as by their labor they produce surplus value. A writer is a productive laborer not insofar as he produces ideas, but insofar as he enriches the publisher who publishes his works, or if he is a wage laborer for the capitalist. Surplus value can arise from a service of some kind, depending on how it is exploited. A doctor or nurse working for profit-making private clinic, which does not produce a material thing as such, but is a service nevertheless produces surplus value. If the opera singer is only paid the value of their labor value, they will produce surplus value for the theater owner. The earnings taken from the ticket sales to watch the performance will be greater than the wages to the performers. In this case, the singer will be deemed productive by capitalism. It makes no difference whether the production lasts for a few seconds or not. Money and credit. With the development of exchange and trade, a special commodity emerges, namely money, to facilitate this process. At any given time, a certain quantity of money is required to circulate the commodities produced. Here we see the importance of money, which Marx calls the universal equivalent. Although the value of commodities is determined by their labor time, we price them in terms of money. Price is simply exchange value expressed in monetary terms. Money arises historically and has taken many forms: slaves, cattle, precious metals. Money is clearly far superior to barter, which is a primitive form of exchange. The universal equivalent, money, can easily be used to exchange one commodity for another. In the past, gold and silver were used as money. Of course, gold and silver also have value, which, like all commodities, is determined by the amount of labor socially necessary for their production. Money or currency became increasingly expressed in terms of precious metals: copper, bronze, silver, and gold. It makes possible the exchange or circulation of commodities. When money was gold coin, the British government issued gold sovereigns with a nominal value of £1 sterling. Money is a measure of value, where commodities are expressed in terms of quantity or certain weight of the precious metal. it becomes a universal means of payment. It can be accumulated, an index of the wealth of individuals, as well as being a reserve or store value. Gold has historically stood out as the universal commodity, far easier to handle, carry, and store, as well as being divisible and durable. In more recent times, money is represented by paper currencies, namely promises by the central bank to pay the amount stated on its banknotes. "I promise to pay the bearer," states the currency of the Bank of England, although it has long ceased to do this. This currency is no longer backed by gold in the banks. Today we have fiat money, which has no intrinsic value, but is backed by the authority of the state. These worthless pieces of paper are only valuable as long as the state acts as guarantor. They become legal tender. These tokens allow the owner a certain share of the wealth of a society. If 10 tokens are issued equal to the size of the national cake, then one such token entitles the owner to a 10% share. Clearly, if you issue more tokens but do not increase the size of the cake, you debase the currency. Paper money becomes a far easier way of manipulating the currency. If 2 banknotes are placed in circulation, where only one existed previously, then, all other things being equal, prices will double. This represents a devaluation. Governments attempted to guard against this by granting a central bank the sole authority to print money. The state in the past regulated a fiduciary currency, where circulating banknotes were only covered by a proportion of bank reserves. If this exceeded, there is a loss of value of the currency. Ultimately, gold remains the only universal equivalent on the world market. After the Second World War, the dollar was used as an international reserve currency, as this was backed by the huge gold reserves in Fort Knox. While still important, it has been undermined by the weakening of the American economy and the floating exchange rates introduced after the 1971 financial crisis. Alongside money came credit. Instead of shipping large quantities of gold from one country to another in payment of goods, a credit system came into being to make such laborious and dangerous transactions unnecessary. As the 19th century economist Richard Cantillon explained, if England owes France 100,000 ounces of silver for the balance of trade, if France owes 100,000 ounces to Holland, and Holland 100,000 to England, all these 3 sums may be offset by bills of exchange between the respective bankers of these 3 states without any need to send silver on any side. Credit becomes a very important lubricant for the development of capitalism. Without credit, the capitalists would need to keep a fund of money to fund their transactions. Otherwise, factories would become idle, waiting for payment at every stage of production, distribution, or retail. No capitalist wants their money tied up in stock. The banks provide this credit by charging interest. This process reflects the merger of finance capital with industrial capital. Banks hold deposits but lend out in excess of these and only keep enough in the bank to cover normal withdrawals. For them, the less idle money in their vaults, the better it is. Their profits are simply a section of the surplus value, creamed off of production by financiers and bankers. The task of banks and finance houses is to redistribute the surplus value created in production into their coffers. In many ways, they act like the tollgate owners of old, who were very busy making money by charging for the opening and closing of gates, but who were socially completely unproductive. This was revealed in the financial crash of 2007, when the banks overextended themselves, with lending in some cases reaching 50 times their entire reserves. While banking liquidity is subject to certain rules, which require banks to keep a fixed proportion of their cash in reserves, they are able to get around this by off-balance accounting and other methods. Shadow banking was built up to circumvent these restrictions. But as soon as there is a loss of confidence in a bank run, the whole thing collapses and banks go bankrupt. The state has to step in to bail them out, as in recent period. Money in modern society is not simply notes and coin, but credit card payments and online sales, which has become a bookkeeping exercise. Credit allows capitalism to go beyond its limits. These can have colossal benefits, but it can also introduce colossal dangers. Banks do not have to print money physically, but simply allocate overdrafts. Quantitative easing is the creation of electronic money by central banks. Speculative bubbles can be created, which produce volatility and eventually collapse. The tulip bubble and the South Sea bubbles are examples of such speculation. Today we have derivatives, SIVs, and CDOs, and other strange creations described by Warren Buffett as financial weapons of mass destruction. Marx described these things as fictitious capital, which have no real value and express no real assets. Fictitious capital nevertheless allows its owner a share of the surplus value produced by society, but unlike a factory, it exists only on paper. Marx simply explained that the capitalists were attempting to make profit less and less from real production, and instead were turning increasingly to speculation. Namely, the desire to make money from money, without the trouble of producing anything. Instead of money, commodity, money, this process can be represented by M to M, money to money. Speculation, however, does not produce surplus value, but only redistributes the surplus value created in real production. Competition and accumulation. Through competition, a capitalist is forced to invest to produce commodities more cheaply than his rivals. In the hands of capitalists, money is accumulated to beget more money. That is its purpose. Capital is therefore self-expanding value. Accumulation is a compelling law under capitalism. Capitalism had become accumulation for accumulation's sake, explained Marx. Or put another way, production for production's sake. Those industries where the productivity of labor lags behind the average are driven out of business by those using the most up-to-date methods. In this way, the introduction of machinery increases the productivity of labor and reduces the necessary labor time, thereby increasing surplus labor time. It allows those who introduce new techniques to sell their products above their individual value, the labor time it costs to produce them, but less than the average cost, thereby gaining super profits. The level of industry determines the proportion of the means of production used and the workers employed. In other words, the capital of a firm will correspond to a certain ratio of constant and variable capital. With increased investment, the productivity of labor grows, so that the worker produces more than before in the same space of time. This means more machinery at the elbow of the workers, and hence the more constant capital grows in relation to variable capital. This is an inevitable development of the accumulation of capital. Marx describes this as a rising organic composition of capital, defined as C/V, the ratio between the constant capital and variable capital employed by the capitalist in the productive process. Through competition, large capitals destroy smaller capitals, leading to a greater concentration and centralization of wealth and industry. This process results in the development of giant corporations with the most modern equipment and technique, whereas in the past, the chemical giant ICI would spend £2 million for a plant. These days it would pay around $600 million. This accumulation of capital constitutes the historic mission of capitalism to develop the productive forces. In the United States, where the process has gone furthest, 500 giant monopolies account for 73.5% of the total GDP output in 2010. If these 500 corporations formed an independent country, it would be the world's second largest economy. In 2011, these 500 firms generated an all-time record of 4,824.5 billion in profits, a 16% jump from the previous year, 2010. On a world scale, the 2,000 biggest companies had an income of 32 trillion, 2.3 trillion in profits, and 138 trillion in assets, and 38 trillion in market value, with profits rising an astonishing 63% in that year between 2010 and 2011. The driving force of capitalist production is not the satisfaction of human need, but the production of surplus value at an ever-increasing rate, a large part of which must be accumulated and incorporated into the new means of production. This drive to ever-increasing monopolization leads, however, to a relative decrease in variable capital, labor power, to constant capital, means of production, raw materials, etc., which results in more investment being placed at the elbow of every worker employed. This has certain adverse consequences. Excuse me. Ultimately, the amount of surplus value obtained by the capitalist depends on two things: the rate of surplus value and the number of workers employed. Clearly, the introduction of machinery tends to reduce the number of workers, and therefore it changes the ratio between variable and constant capital. The relationship between dead and living labor. Machinery serves to expel workers from the factories. This inevitably leads, all things being equal, to a declining rate of profit, Marx explains. Hence, the application of machinery for the production of surplus value implies a contradiction which is eminent in it. The rate of profit. As explained, profit comes from the variable part of capital, labor power, as the constant part of capital simply transfers its own value to the end product. With the development of capitalism, the capitalists invest greater and greater amounts of capital. But with increasing technological advance, the greater proportion goes into constant capital, and the proportion going to variable capital decreases. Since it is from the variable capital that profit is made, the result is a falling rate of profit. While the rate of surplus value measures the ratio between surplus value created and variable capital paid for, the rate of profit measures the ratio between the capitalist profit and the total capital the capitalist has to pay out for production. This is considered the capitalist rate of return. If we take the example of an economy where the total income in the year is 50 million pounds, this is made up of C plus V plus S, constant capital, variable capital, and surplus value. In figure terms, this might be C equals 10 million, V equals 20 million, and S equals 20 million. The rate of exploitation in this economy is therefore S/V, where 20/20 equals 100%. However, the rate of profit is the ratio between the surplus value and the entire capital outlay, S/paragraph, C plus V, end paragraph, comma, 20/30, or just under 67%. This measures profitability of the capitalist's investment. And I'll pause here a moment to say that we are explaining mathematically why you are a wage slave and how the owner of the company you work for exploits your labor. You work, I said yesterday in this reading, you work for 8 hours, for example. Maybe it's 4 or 6, depending on the industry. Maybe it's 12 hours. But in the first 2 to 4 hours, you produce enough surplus value to pay for your wages for the entire shift and for the wear and tear of the machinery you use and the products that are used up in the production of whatever you're making or doing. So in the first 2 to 4 hours, you've already made enough for you to go home and get the same amount of money, but the profit that you make after that for the rest of your shift is stolen from you. So in the first 20 to 40% of your shift, you make enough money to pay for your whole day of work that you actually work, and the rest of it is surplus that is just pure profit that your boss takes from you so they can buy a second house or a third car or a vacation or their prostitutes or whatever drug habit they're maintaining so that they can keep living like they do. If the capitalists invest 10 million pounds in new machines and equipment, it means that constant capital, C, has now doubled to 20 million pounds per year. We take the rate of exploitation as constant. The rate of profit then falls. 2/40 equals 50%. There has been an increase in the organic composition of capital, which brings about a fall in the rate of profit. This is a general tendency under capitalism, as the system expands and the productivity of labor grows. At one point, Marx describes this tendency for the rate of profit to fall as, quote, in every aspect, the most important law of modern political economy, end quote. He later modified this view to a law of, quote, great importance. The emphasis clearly changed. In any case, Marx never considered this law or tendency an absolute phenomenon. Every capitalist is striving to increase the productivity of his workforce, namely the amount produced in a given period of time. If this is so, why is there not a permanent fall in the rate of profit? How is capitalism able to get round this inherent obstacle? There must be some counteracting influences at work, which cross and annul the effect of the general law, and which give it merely the characteristic of a tendency, for which reason we have referred to the fall of the general rate of profit as a tendency to fall. Marx explained that this double-edged law is more of a tendency, which produces its own counteracting tendencies, and under certain conditions can even result in the rate of profit to rise. He deals with these counteracting forces in chapter 14 of the third volume of Capital, where he outlines an array of factors which serves to modify this law. These counteracting factors outlined in Capital include the increasing intensity of exploitation, depression of wages below the value of labor power, cheapening of the elements of constant capital, relative overpopulation, foreign trade, the increase of stock capital, which theoretically, quote, may be introduced into the circulation, end quote. Marx pointed out that the intensification of exploitation, relative and surplus value, can restore the rate of profit. We have clearly witnessed this effect in the employer's offensive over the last 3 decades, as all workers can testify. Every place I've worked in the last 2 decades, since I was 16, has been understaffed and everyone overworked, but also simultaneously working short shifts so that nobody gets full-time hours. Therefore, nobody gets benefits except for the people who are managers who work on a salary, and they are the most exploited workers because they work more hours than anybody. And if you broke down their salary by how many hours they work, they make less per hour than everyone that works for them. The capitalists have sought to increase their profit margin by squeezing every atom of surplus value from the sweat and nervous strain of the working class. Globalization and the use of migrant labor has also been a means of driving down wages, which in many cases are below the value of labor power. This can also be seen in the various sweatshops that exist around the world, which produce all kinds of commodities from shoewear to clothing for multinational companies. Sweated labor has been used where workers have been stripped of all rights, paid below the minimum, and treated like cattle. These methods have worked hand in hand with the existence of mass unemployment, which acts as a downward pressure on wage rates. The opening up of the former Soviet Union and China to capitalism has provided a massive boost to capitalism in the form of ever-cheapening supply of commodities, including machinery. The price of computers and its components has fallen dramatically, as well as mobile phones and other electronic equipment. Their cost of production has fallen due to the less labor time needed for their production. This cheapening of the different elements of constant capital has again been a feature of the current period and has helped drive up the rate of profit from historically low levels. This process has benefited from globalization and the opening up of new markets and the increased exploitation of the old. Privatization of state companies and utilities has again meant a bonanza for the multinational corporations and the financial giants which stride the world, squeezing out surplus value from every quarter. Labor's share in national income has been in decline across the main capitalist economies, OECD, since 1980. The gap has been especially wide in the US, where productivity rose by 83% between 1973 and 2007, but male median real wages increased by just 5%. The share of the U.S. national income that goes to wages has fallen to its lowest level since records began after the Second World War. The production of relative surplus value is a process of progressively cheapening commodities, with the new commodities containing less value than before. A larger mass of use values will be expressed in a smaller total value. Therefore, what we are dealing with in regards to the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is only a tendency which manifests itself over the whole history of capitalist development. As Marx explains, quote, "Thus the law acts only as a tendency, and it is only under certain circumstances and only after long periods that its effects become strikingly pronounced. Thus, there can be long periods, even decades, where the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is cancelled out by the above counteracting tendencies. These can cut across the process and even reverse it, but not indefinitely." Mark Glick, in his 1987 book, The Current Crisis, publishes the following figures for the long-term rate of profit in the United States. In 1819, the rate of profit was 22%, but by 1983, it had dropped to 10%. The all-time low was 1922, where the rate of profit was at 2%. But, personal note, you can see the overall trend is down by 50%, more than 50%. These figures reveal that from a broad historical point of view, while leaving aside the inevitable cyclical fluctuations, the rate of profit now is lower than it was 100 years ago. And yet, for whole periods, this tendency has been reversed. Eventually, this downward tendency will inevitably reassert itself and act as a further barrier to the development of capitalism. But the crisis of capitalism cannot be explained simply by the tendency of the rate of profit to decline. Attributing the cause of capitalist crisis to a declining rate of profit does not correspond to the theory or the facts. Rosa Luxemburg ridiculed those who believe that capitalism would collapse as soon as the rate of profit fell to zero. She poked fun at how long it would take before capitalism would collapse as a result of the falling rate of profit, roughly until the sun burns out. However, that was a quote, she said. However, the capitalist can put up with a falling rate of profit for a long time, as we have seen. What they cannot afford is when the massive profit falls. This took place towards the end of 2008, which precipitated the biggest slump since the 1930s. Excuse me. crisis and overproduction. This epoch of monopoly capitalism, the laws governing the system, become increasingly twisted and distorted. Monopoly does not abolish competition, but twists and mangles it. The power of the monopolies colossally distorts the market by restricting supply as well through price fixing. While capitalism appears to be chaotic, it is not complete chaos. In fact, as Engels explained, its laws operate in and through the anarchy of production. The capitalist system experiences periodic crises, booms and slumps. These have always been present under the capitalist system, and such crises are in fact unique to capitalism. The idea that capitalism is a system of equilibrium and not periodic crisis, first put forward by Jean-Baptiste Say, quote, Say's law, and more recently connected to the efficient market hypothesis, has been demonstrated to be utterly false. The idea that supply creates its own demand was and is simply not true. The market economy is not a self-adjusting system as once thought. This is evident today with the existence of mass unemployment and deep-seated crisis. All attempts to abolish the cycle of boom and slump have utterly failed. The capitalist periodic crises are crises of overproduction in both consumer and capital goods for the purpose of capitalist production. This is not simply the overproduction of capital, but also the overproduction of commodities. One goes hand in hand with the other. Overproduction arises from the contradictions of the market economy and the division into mutually conflicting classes. The division of society into mutually conflicting classes. In the final analysis, the working class, the producer of all values, cannot buy back the values it produces, which at a certain point becomes a barrier to further economic development and leads to a crisis of overproduction. As Engels explained in Anti-Düring, quote, the enormous expansive force of modern industry compared with that of gases is mere child's play. It appears to us now as a necessity for expansion, both qualitative and quantitative, that laughs at all resistance. Such resistance is offered by consumption, by sales, by the markets, and for the products of modern industry. But the capacity for extension, extensive and intensive, of the markets is primarily governed by quite different laws that work much less energetically. The extension of the markets cannot keep pace with the extension of production. The collision becomes inevitable. And as this cannot produce any real solution, so long as it does not break in pieces the capitalist mode of production, the collisions become periodic. Capitalist production has begotten another vicious cycle. He goes on to describe a crisis where the laws of production and circulation are turned upside down. Money, the means of circulation, becomes now a hindrance to circulation. The factors that serve to promote the boom now turn into their opposite. Commerce is at a standstill. The markets are gutted. Products accumulate. As multitudinous as they are unsellable, hard cash disappears. Credit vanishes. Factories are closed. And the mass of workers are in want of the means of subsistence, because they have produced too much of the means of subsistence. Bankruptcy follows bankruptcy, execution upon execution. The stagnation lasts for years. Productive forces and products are wasted and destroyed wholesale, until the accumulated mass of commodities finally filter off, more or less depreciated in value, until production and exchange gradually begin to move again. And so, over and over again. The productive forces have outgrown the narrow limits of private ownership and the nation-state, as Marx and Engels explain in the Communist Manifesto. And how does the bourgeoisie go over these crises? On the one hand, by enforced destruction of a mass of productive forces, and on the other, by the conquest of new markets, and by the more thorough exploitation of the old ones. That is to say, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented. These lines are as fresh and relevant today as when they were first written over 160 years ago. The ultimate cause of capitalist crisis is overproduction. The working class can never buy back the total production of its labor. The capitalists cannot simply increase the wages to the level where surplus value is eliminated, since the justification of capitalism is the maximum extraction of surplus value. On the other hand, other things being equal, if the wages of the working class increase, the capitalist profit will fall, and this will cause a fall in investment. The system, however, is clearly not in a permanent state of crisis and functions temporarily through the interaction between the two main departments of the economy, the production of consumer goods and the production of capital goods, the means of production. The capitalists are able to overcome the contradictions they face through investment, namely by reinvesting the surplus value extracted from the labor of the working class into new means of production and thereby creating new markets. In other words, capitalism creates its own markets through investment, temporarily overcoming its contradictions. However, there are limits to everything. This investment, in turn, creates greater productive capacity overall, and serves to exacerbate the new crisis of overproduction when it finally arrives. At a certain point, the market cannot absorb the commodities that are produced, and overproduction ensues. Markets become saturated, and the surplus value held within commodities cannot be realized. Factories are closed, and workers are thrown out of work. There is no escape from this. In other words, this reinvestment and expansion of the market only serves to create the conditions for an even deeper slump in the future, as Marx explains in the third volume of Capital. The ultimate reason for all real crisis always remains the poverty and restricted consumption of the masses, as opposed to the drive of capitalist production to develop the productive forces, as though only the absolute consuming power of society constituted their limit. And further, the conditions of direct exploitation and of those realizing it are not identical. They diverge only in place and time, but also logically. The first are only limited to the productive power of society, the latter by the proportional relation of the various branches of production and the consumer power of society. We are not talking about people's needs in regard to consumption, but their ability to pay. Marx explains that this is determined by the consumer power based on antagonistic conditions of distribution, which reduce the consumption of the bulk of society to a minimum varying within more or less narrow limits. But the more the productive power develops, the more it finds itself at variance with the narrow basis on which the conditions of consumption rest. And I'll end there for my daily reading. And I'm going to move on to my daily meditation, yoga, and martial arts routine. I encourage you to follow along with me, because I have a very systematic, holistic, whole body yoga and martial arts workout. And while I meditate, I'm just going to be sitting listening to audiobooks. This time we're listening to Lenin until we get through pretty much everything written by Lenin. And there's no esoteric, mystical stuff in my daily routine. It's a very atheistic, realistic system of meditation, Ashtanga yoga, and mixed martial arts, which I have put into practice in competition in real life when I was in the military, when I was an international revolutionary in the YPG, International Volunteers, fighting on the front lines against ISIS, and fighting in tournaments and in the cage, as you can see behind me. So I will shut up, and I will put on an audiobook by Lenin. And I'm going to close the door to cut off some of this background noise. So get settled into your spot. Get ready to meditate, listen to some audiobooks with me. We're listening to Lenin today, and then we'll be practicing yoga and martial arts. Hold it, YouTube. This is my spot. Oh, it's still open, buddy. You can go out if you want. Be nice to your brother. Okay. Oops. For those just tuning in, we're about to meditate, listening to a playlist of audiobooks by Lenin. I practice listening meditation, Zen meditation, just sitting, listening to the breath, listening to actually practical and useful audiobooks. And we have a good few short audiobooks lined up today by Lenin, and we're going to pick up where we left off yesterday in The Aim of the Proletarian Struggle.
In any case, Comrade Martov's conclusion that the conference agreed with Trotsky, of all people, on the question of the relations between the proletariat and the peasantry in the struggle for power is an amazing contradiction of the facts, is an attempt to read into a word a meaning that was never discussed, not mentioned, and not even thought of at the conference. So that's the end of section 3. Now moving on to section 4 of The Aim of the Proletarian Struggle in Our Revolution by Lenin from 1909. Comrade Martov touches on Kautsky, and in doing so manages once more to pack so many inaccuracies in so few words that to answer him to the point, we are obliged to tell the reader the whole story practically from the beginning. The statement that, quote, many, including Lenin in his preface to Kautsky's article on prospects, emphatically denied the bourgeois character of our revolution, unquote, is utterly false, as also is the statement that Kautsky, quote, has declared that the Russian Revolution is not bourgeois. The facts are entirely different. Plekhanov put questions to a number of representatives of the international social democratic movement. His first question was about the general character of the Russian Revolution, and the second was about, quote, the attitude of the Social Democratic Party towards the bourgeois Democrats who are fighting in their own way for political liberty, unquote. In formulating the questions in this way, the comrade Plekhanov committed 2 errors against Marxism. First, he confused the, quote, general character of the revolution, its social and economic content, with the question of the motive forces of the revolution. Marxists must not confuse these questions. They must not even directly deduce the answer to the second question from the answer to the first without a special concrete analysis. Secondly, he confused the role of the peasantry in our revolution with the role of the bourgeois democracy in general. Actually, both the peasantry and the liberals are covered by the scientific term bourgeois democracy, but the attitude of the proletariat towards these 2 varieties of bourgeois democracy must of necessity differ materially. Kautsky immediately detected Comrade Plekhanov's errors and corrected them in his reply. As regards the social and economic content of the revolution, Kautsky did not deny its bourgeois character. On the contrary, he definitely recognized it. Here are Kautsky's statements relevant to the point as quoted in those same prospects, which have been so utterly garbled by Comrade Martov. Quote, the present revolution in Russia, in its effect on the countryside, can lead only to the creation of a strong peasantry on the basis of private property and land, and thereby create as wide a gulf between the proletariat and the property-owning section of the rural population as exists already in Western Europe. Therefore, one cannot imagine that the present Russian Revolution would lead immediately to the introduction of the socialist mode of production, even if it temporarily gave the reins of government to the Social Democrats, unquote. It was this passage that prompted the following words in Lenin's preface, quote, needless to say, Kautsky fully agrees with the fundamental thesis of all Russian social democrats, that the peasant movement is non-socialist, that socialism cannot arise from small peasant production, etc., unquote. Comrade Martov's assertion that Lenin positively denied the bourgeois character of our revolution is positively at variance with the truth. Lenin says just the opposite. Kautsky definitely recognized that in its general character, i.e., in its social and economic content, our revolution is bourgeois. Plekhanov's first question, wrote Kautsky in this article, quote, cannot, it seems to me, be given a simple answer one way or the other. The time for bourgeois revolutions, i.e., revolutions in which the bourgeoisie is the motive force, has passed. It has passed for Russia too. The bourgeoisie is not one of the motive forces of the present revolutionary movement in Russia, and that being the case, this movement cannot be called bourgeois, unquote. As the reader sees, Kautsky here makes it perfectly clear what he is discussing. He is perfectly clear speaking of a bourgeois revolution, not in the sense of its social and economic content, but in the sense of a revolution, quote, of which the bourgeoisie is the motive force. To proceed, Kautsky corrected Plekhanov's second mistake by drawing a clear and definite distinction between, quote, liberal and peasant bourgeois democracy. Kautsky stated that, quote, the revolutionary strength of Russian social democracy lies in the community of interests of the industrial proletariat and the peasantry, that, quote, without the peasants we cannot now gain the victory in Russia. Apropos of the dull question of the word and, which monopolizes Comrade Martov's discussion of principle, it is interesting to note that in this same article, i.e. in 1906, Kautsky employs on one and the same page the expression rely, quote, on what class can the Russian proletariat rely? And the expression, quote, the alliance between the proletariat and other classes in the revolutionary struggle must primarily be based on community of economic interests, unquote. Perhaps Comrade Martov will accuse Karl Kautsky, will say that in 1906, in anticipation of the December 1908 conference of the RSDLP, Kautsky set out to, quote, mislead the readers, to slur over and paste over the differences between the Bolsheviks and the Polish Social Democrats, to engage in pettifoggery and so forth. We may point out that in advocating the idea of an alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry in the Russian bourgeois revolution, Kautsky is not proposing anything new, but is entirely following in the footsteps of Marx and Engels. In 1848, Marx wrote in Die Neue Rheinische Zeitung, quote, the big bourgeoisie, i.e. the German bourgeoisie after March 18, 1848, quote, anti-revolutionary from the very outset, conducted a defensive and offensive alliance with reaction out of fear of the people, that is to say, the workers and the democratic bourgeoisie, unquote. The German Revolution of 1848, wrote Marx on July 29, 1848, quote, is a mere travesty of the French Revolution of 1789. The French bourgeoisie of 1789 did not abandon its allies, the peasants, for a moment. The German bourgeoisie of 1848 is betraying the peasants without the slightest compunction, unquote. Here, in relation to a bourgeois revolution, Marx is clearly contraposing the counter-revolutionary bourgeoisie, allied with reaction, to the working class, allied with the democratic bourgeoisie, i.e. primarily the peasantry. And this view can hardly be put down to the fact that Marx's socialist world outlook had not fully crystallized at that time. 44 years later, in 1892, in his article Historical Materialism, from Neue Zeit 11, Volume 1, Engels wrote the following, quote, in all the three great bourgeois risings, the Reformation and Peasant War in the 16th century in Germany, the English Revolution of the 17th century, and the French in the 18th, the peasantry furnishes the army that has to do the fighting. Had it not been for that yeomanry in the English Revolution, and for the plebeian element in the towns, the bourgeoisie alone would never have fought the matter out to the bitter end, and would never have brought Charles I to the scaffold, unquote. Consequently, the specific feature of the Russian bourgeois revolution is merely that instead of the plebeian element of the towns taking second place as it did in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, it is the proletariat which is taking first place in the 20th century. That's the end of Section 4, now moving on to Section 5 of The Aim of the Proletarian Struggle in Our Revolution by Lenin, 1909. To conclude, Comrade Martov has touched on an extremely important question that deserves discussing very thoroughly in the columns of the party's central organ. But it is not a question to touch on, it must be examined in great detail, in the light not only of the teachings of Marx and Engels, but also of the experience of the Russian Revolution of 1905 to 1907. The suggestion that the idea of a revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry is the result of a neurotic spell cast over the Social Democrats can only provoke a smile. If that were true, the quasi-Marxists who argue in this way should first of all have accused Kautsky, Marx, and Engels of falling under the neurotic spell. In all the great bourgeois revolutions, decisive victory could be achieved only by the proletariat, more or less developed in alliance with the peasantry. And the same holds true for the bourgeois revolution in Russia. In the experience of 1905 to 1907, the truth of this was given a practical demonstration by every important turn in events. For in practice, all decisive actions, both combative and parliamentary, were actually joint actions of the proletariat and the peasantry. Our party holds firmly to the view that the role of the proletariat is the role of leader in the bourgeois democratic revolution, that joint actions of the proletariat and the peasantry are essential to carry it through to victory, that unless political power is won by the revolutionary classes, victory is impossible. Rejection of these truths must inevitably doom social democrats to vacillation, to movement without a goal, to advocating casual agreements with complete disregard for principle, and in practice means falling captive to the cadets, i.e., making the working class dependent upon the liberal monarchist counter-revolutionary bourgeoisie. So that is the end of section 5 and the end of the entire audiobook, The Aim of the Proletarian Struggle in Our Revolution by Lenin, 1909. What did you think? Leave a comment, and we'll continue the discussion in the comments below. In the meantime, thanks for listening. Thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month. Every donation is both extremely encouraging and materially helpful, so thank you all for that. If you want to help out but financial contributions are not your thing, understandable. Liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting all help to boost the channel and to put this content in front of more eyes, to expand the conversation about bringing down capitalism and building socialism, so you can do those instead. Whatever it is that you do online and in your community to expand this conversation about building socialism, thanks for doing it, and we will catch you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the April 2023 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Differences in the European Labor Movement by Lenin from 1910. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this piece was published in Zvezda number 1, December 16, 1910, and signed B. Ilyin. It's published here according to that text in Zvezda. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1974, Moscow, Volume 16. HTML transcription and markup by R. Simbala, and it's online at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive, Marxists.org. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. So we begin with an editorial note explaining some of the background here. The article, Differences in the European Labor Movement, was published in number 4 of the newspaper Zvezda, the Star, in the section entitled Letters from Abroad. Zvezda was a Bolshevik legal newspaper. It was the predecessor of Pravda, and it was issued in St. Petersburg from December 16, 1910, so this was in the inaugural issue, to April 22nd, 1912. At first, it was a weekly, and then from January 1912, it was a twice-weekly paper, then from March, 3 times a week. On February 26, 1912, there appeared simultaneously with Zvezda the first issue of Nevskaya Zvezda, which became the continuation of Zvezda after the latter had been closed down. The last 27th issue of Nevskaya Zvezda was published on October 5, 1912. Contributors to Zvezda were N.N. Baturin, K.S. Yeremeyev, V.M. Molotov, M.S. Olminsky, N.G. Poletayev, J.V. Stalin, and also A.M. Gorky. Until the autumn of 1911, pro-party Mensheviks, Plekhanovites, participated in Zvezda. The ideological leadership of the newspaper was carried out from abroad by Lenin, who published in it and in Nevskaya Zvezda about 50 articles. The legal newspaper Zvezda, directed by Lenin, was a militant Bolshevik organ which upheld the program of the illegal party. Zvezda established permanent close ties with the workers and devoted an extensive section to workers' correspondence. The circulation of individual issues reached 50,000 to 60,000. The newspaper suffered continual persecution by the government. Out of 96 issues of Zvezda and Nevskaya Zvezda, 39 were confiscated, and 10 were subjected to fines. Zvezda prepared the way for the publication of the Bolshevik daily newspaper, Pravda, and was closed down on the day that Pravda appeared. So that's some background on Zvezda. Now let's get into the audiobook. The principal tactical differences in the present-day labor movement of Europe and America reduce themselves to a struggle against two big trends that are departing from Marxism, which has in fact become the dominant theory in this movement. These two trends are revisionism, such as opportunism and reformism, and anarchism, anarcho-syndicalism, anarcho-socialism. Quick comment here, we were just talking about in one of the last live streams, like maybe the last live stream we just did a couple of days ago, what you find in the US left, or at least among people who call themselves left, is lots of Democrats, lots of anarchists. And then, thanks to the LaRouche people, now some quote MAGA communists as well, who are calling themselves, Marxist, but are actually Republican, libertarian, fascist. Obviously, we're trying to increase the proportion of actual Marxists by putting out this broad-based agitation and education that we do here at the channel and that similar channels do, in the hopes that people will be enticed to form study groups, clubs, and other things on the way to forming the party that we actually need. But clearly, this text will be relevant to today's struggles as well. Continuing, both of these departures from the Marxist theory and Marxist tactics that are dominant in the labor movement were to be observed in various forms and in various shades in all civilized countries during the more than half-century of history of the mass labor movement. This fact alone shows that these departures cannot be attributed to accident, or to the mistakes of individuals or groups, or even to the influence of national characteristics and traditions, and so forth. There must be some deep-rooted causes in the economic system and in the character of the development of all capitalist countries, which constantly give rise to these departures from Marxism. A small book, The Tactical Differences in the Labor Movement, published last year, 1909, by a Dutch Marxist, Anton Pannekoek, represents an interesting attempt at a scientific investigation of these causes. In our exposition, we shall acquaint the reader with Pannekoek's conclusions, which, it must be recognized, are quite correct. One of the most profound causes that periodically give rise to differences over tactics is the very growth of the labor movement. If this movement is not measured by the criterion of some fantastic ideal, but is regarded as the practical movement of ordinary people, it will be clear that the enlistment of larger and larger numbers of new recruits, the attraction of new sections of the working people, must be inevitably accompanied by waverings in the sphere of theory and tactics, by repetitions of old mistakes, by a temporary reversion to antiquated views and antiquated methods, and so forth. The labor movement of every country periodically spends a varying amount of energy, attention, and time on the, quote, training of newcomers. Furthermore, the rate at which capitalism develops varies in different countries and in different spheres of the national economy. Marxism is most easily, rapidly, completely, and lastingly assimilated by the working class and its ideologists, where large-scale industry is most developed. Economic relations which are backward or which lag in their development constantly lead to the appearance of supporters of the labor movement who assimilate only certain aspects of Marxism, only certain parts of the New World outlook, or individual slogans and demands, being unable to make a determined break with all of the traditions of the bourgeois world outlook in general and the bourgeois democratic world outlook in particular. Again, a constant source of differences is the dialectical nature of social development, which proceeds in contradictions and through contradictions. Capitalism is progressive because it destroys the old methods of production and develops productive forces, yet at the same time, at a certain stage of development, it retards the growth of productive forces. holds them back. It develops, organizes, and disciplines the workers, and it crushes, oppresses, leads to degeneration, poverty, etc. Capitalism creates its own gravedigger, itself creates the elements of a new system, yet at the same time, without a leap, these individual elements change nothing in the general state of affairs and do not affect the rule of capital. This leap is, of course, a proletarian revolution. It is Marxism, the theory of dialectical materialism, that is able to encompass these contradictions of living reality, of the living history of capitalism and the working class movement. But needless to say, the masses learn from life and not from books, and therefore certain individuals or groups constantly exaggerate, elevate to a one-sided theory, to a one-sided system of tactics, now one and now another feature of capitalist development, now one and now another lesson of this development. Bourgeois ideologists, liberals and Democrats, not understanding Marxism and not understanding the modern labor movement, are constantly jumping from one futile extreme to another. At one time, they explain the whole matter by asserting that evil-minded persons, quote, incite class against class. At another, they console themselves with the idea that the Workers' Party is, quote, a peaceful party of reform. Both anarcho-syndicalism and reformism must be regarded as a direct product of this bourgeois world outlook and its influence. Let's say that again. Both anarcho-syndicalism and reformism must be regarded as a direct product of this bourgeois world outlook and its significance. They seize upon one aspect of the labor movement, elevate one-sidedness to a theory, and declare mutually exclusive those tendencies or features of this movement that are a specific peculiarity of a given period, of given conditions of working class activity. But real life, real history, includes these different tendencies, just as life and development in nature include both slow evolution and rapid leaps, breaks in continuity. The revisionists regard as phrasemongering all arguments about leaps and about the working class movement being antagonistic in principle to the whole of the old society. They regard reforms as a partial realization of socialism. The anarcho-syndicalists reject, quote, petty work, especially the utilization of the parliamentary platform. In practice, the latter tactics amount to waiting for great days, along with an inability to muster the forces which create great events. Both of them hinder the thing that is most important and most urgent, namely, to unite the workers in big, powerful, and properly functioning organizations, capable of functioning well under all circumstances, good and bad, great and petty, I would add, permeated with the spirit of the class struggle, clearly realizing their aims and trained in the true Marxist world outlook. We shall here permit ourselves a slight digression, and note in parenthesis so as to avoid possible misunderstandings, that Panakoic illustrates his analysis exclusively by examples taken from West European history, especially the history of Germany and France, not referring to Russia at all. If at times it seems that he is alluding to Russia, it is only because the basic tendencies which give rise to definite departures from Marxist tactics are to be observed in our country too, despite the vast difference between Russia and the West in culture, everyday life, and historical and economic development. Finally, an extremely important cause of differences among those taking part in the labor movement lies in changes in the tactics of the ruling classes in general and of the bourgeoisie in particular. If the tactics of the bourgeoisie were always uniform, or at least of the same kind, the working class would rapidly learn to reply to them by tactics just as uniform, or of the same kind. But as a matter of fact, in every country, the bourgeoisie inevitably devises two systems of rule, two methods of fighting for its interests and of maintaining its domination. These methods at times succeed each other, and at times are interwoven in various combinations. The first of these is the method of force, the method which rejects all concessions to the labor movement, the method of supporting all the old and obsolete institutions, the method of irreconcilably rejecting reforms. Such is the nature of the conservative policy, which in Western Europe is becoming less and less a policy of the landowning classes, and more one of the varieties of bourgeois policy in general. The second is the method of liberalism, of steps toward the development of political rights, toward reforms, concessions, and so forth. The bourgeoisie passes from one method to the other not because of the malicious intent of individuals and not accidentally, but owing to the fundamentally contradictory nature of its own position. Normal capitalist society cannot develop successfully without a firmly established representative system and without certain political rights for the population, which is bound to be distinguished by its relatively high, quote, cultural demands. These demands for a certain minimum of culture are created by the conditions of the capitalist mode of production itself, with its high technique, complexity, flexibility, mobility, rapid development of world competition, and so forth. In consequence, vacillations in the tactics of the bourgeoisie, transitions from the system of force to the system of apparent concessions, have been characteristic of the history of all European countries during the last half century, the various countries developing primarily the application of the one method or the other at definite periods. For instance, in the 60s and 70s of the 19th century, Britain was the classical country of, quote, liberal bourgeois policy. Germany in the 70s and 80s adhered to the method of force, and so on. Quick comment here, I just want to point out, this is from 1910, so well before the New Deal in the USA, but you could argue that that was an example of the kind of change in policy that Lenin is describing. Continuing, when this method, the method of force, prevailed in Germany, a one-sided echo of this particular system of bourgeois government was the growth of anarcho-syndicalism, or anarchism as it was then called, in the labor movement. The Young at the beginning of the 90s, Johann Most at the beginning of the 80s. Two footnotes there. The Young faction was a petty bourgeois, semi-anarchist group formed in the German Social Democratic Party in 1890 and composed chiefly of undergraduate students and young writers, hence the name. It put forward a platform that rejected any social democratic participation in parliament. They were expelled from the party by the Erfurt Congress in October 1891. Quick reminder here also, back in these days, social democracy was sort of the general name for Marxism at that time. So German Social Democratic Party, there you go. Also, Johann Most, German Social Democrat. In 1880 at the Baden Congress, he was expelled from the party on account of his disorganizing behavior. In the 80s, he became an adherent of anarchism. Back to the main text. When in 1890 the change to concessions took place, this change, as is always the case, proved to be even more dangerous to the labor movement, and it gave rise to an equally one-sided echo of bourgeois reformism, opportunism in the labor movement. Quote, the positive, real aim of the liberal policy of the bourgeoisie, Panakoek says, is to mislead the workers, to cause a split in their ranks, to convert their policy into an impotent adjunct of an impotent, always impotent and ephemeral, sham reformism, unquote. Not infrequently, the bourgeoisie for a certain time achieves its object by a liberal policy, which, as Panakoek justly remarks, is a more crafty policy. A part of the workers and a part of their representatives at times allow themselves to be deceived by these seeming concessions. The revisionists declare that the doctrine of the class struggle is antiquated, or they begin to conduct a policy which is in fact a renunciation of the class struggle. The zigzags of bourgeois tactics intensify revisionism within the labor movement, and not infrequently bring the differences within the labor movement to the point of an outright split. All causes of the kind indicated give rise to differences over tactics within the labor movement and within the proletarian ranks. But there is not and cannot be a Chinese wall between the proletariat and the sections of the petty bourgeoisie in contact with it, including the peasantry. It's clear that the passing of certain individuals, groups, and sections of the petty bourgeoisie into the ranks of the proletariat is bound, in its turn, to give rise to vacillations in the tactics of the latter. So comment, why is that? So basically, as sections of the petty bourgeoisie, well, as Lenin says, individuals, groups, and then whole sections of the petty bourgeoisie, specifically he's talking about the peasantry there, but could be other kinds of petty bourgeoisie as well, going into the proletariat, becoming in their actual class status proletarians, they're going to be bringing in that petty bourgeois mindset with them, and this will in turn give rise to vacillations in tactics. Okay. The experience of the labor movement of various countries helps us to understand on the basis of concrete practical questions the nature of Marxist tactics. It helps the younger countries to distinguish more clearly the true class significance of departures from Marxism and to combat these departures more successfully. That's the end of the audiobook. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below. We'll continue the discussion there as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. Every donation is encouraging. They're also materially helpful. I would make content even if no one supported, but all of the support allows me to spend a lot more time per week on what we're doing on the channel, the research, the preparation, the recording, the editing, the live streams, all of it, which is now all regular content on the channel. And again, that is thanks in large part to the patrons. Also, whether you're a patron or not, engagement counts. Like, share, subscribe, and that will help YouTube to recommend this content to more people. So it's an easy way to help out and to pass this message along to other workers who are trying to find answers to their questions about capitalism and class struggle who you might not even know personally. Then again, you might be referring this video indirectly to somebody who's in your workplace. And then when you try to form that union a year from now, who knows? All right, thanks again, and we will see you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the October 2021 edition of Socialism for All. And it's an audiobook and discussion of certain features of the historical development of Marxism by Lenin from 1910. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this text is the 13th entry in the Basic Marxism-Leninism Study Guide, which we've been doing on the channel over the past year and a half, along with many other side readings mixed in to expand on the background and just cover other topics. But this is a curriculum that comes from the organization MAI, Movimiento Antiimperialista, or anti-imperialist movement. And it's a good way to learn basic Marxism-Leninism, so I'll put the link to that overall playlist in the description, along with the link to the original text. So this work was published in Zvezda number 2, December 28, 1910, signed V. Ilyin. It was published here according to the Zvezda text. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1974, Moscow, Volume 17. It was translated by Dora Cox, HTML transcription by R. Simbala. It's in the public domain at Marxists Internet Archive. Thanks as usual to Marxists Internet Archive at marxists.org, where they host thousands of free Marxist texts. Please go check them out. So let's get into the audiobook. Our doctrine, said Engels, referring to himself and his famous friend, is not a dogma, but a guide to action. This classical statement stresses, with remarkable force and expressiveness, that aspect of Marxism which is very often lost sight of. And by losing sight of it, we turn Marxism into something one-sided, distorted, and lifeless. We deprive it of its lifeblood. We undermine its basic theoretical foundations, dialectics, the doctrine of historical development, all embracing and full of contradictions. We undermine its connection with the definite, practical tasks of the epoch, which may change with every new turn of history. Indeed, in our time, among those interested in the fate of Marxism in Russia, we very frequently meet with people who lose sight of just this aspect of Marxism. Yet, it must be clear to everybody that in recent years, Russia has undergone changes so abrupt as to alter the situation with unusual rapidity and unusual force, the social and political situation, which in a most direct and immediate manner determines the conditions for action, and hence, its aims. Quick note there was the first Russian Revolution in 1905. It was not fully successful, but they did set up Soviets, which were workers' councils for directing political activity after that. And then the fully successful revolution was in 1917. So this is 1910 in between those two. I am not referring, of course, to general and fundamental aims which do not change with turns of history if the fundamental relation between classes remains unchanged. It is perfectly obvious that this general trend of economic, and not only economic, evolution in Russia, like the fundamental relation between the various classes of Russian society, has not changed during, say, the last 6 years. But the aims of immediate and direct action changed very sharply during this period, just as the actual social and political situation changed. And consequently, since Marxism is a living doctrine, various aspects of it were bound to become prominent. In order to make this idea clear, let us cast a glance at the change in the actual social and political situation over the last 6 years. We immediately differentiate two 3-year periods, one ending roughly with the summer of 1907 and the other with the summer of 1910. The first 3-year period, regarded from the purely theoretical standpoint, is distinguished by rapid changes in the fundamental features of the state system in Russia. The course of these changes, moreover, was very uneven, and the oscillations in both directions were of considerable amplitude. The social and economic basis of these changes in the, quote, superstructure was the action of all classes of Russian society in the most diverse fields: activity inside and outside the Duma or Congress, the press, unions, meetings, and so forth. Action so open and oppressive, and on a mass scale, such as is rarely to be observed in history. The second 3-year period, on the contrary, is distinguished, we repeat that we confine ourselves to the purely theoretical, sociological standpoint, by an evolution so slow that it almost amounted to stagnation. There were no changes of any importance to be observed in the state system. There were hardly any open and diversified actions by the classes in the majority of the arenas in which these actions had developed in the preceding period. The similarity between the two periods is that Russia underwent capitalist evolution in both of them. The contradiction between this economic evolution and the existence of a number of feudal and medieval institutions still remained and was not stifled, but rather aggravated by the fact that certain institutions assumed a partially bourgeois character. The difference between the two periods is that in the first, the question of exactly what form the above-mentioned rapid and uneven changes would take was the dominant, history-making issue. The content of these changes was bound to be bourgeois, owing to the capitalist character of Russia's evolution. But there are different kinds of bourgeoisie. The middle and big bourgeoisie, which professes a more or less moderate liberalism, was, owing to its very class position, afraid of abrupt changes, and strove for the retention of large remnants of the old institutions, both in the agrarian system and in the political superstructure. The rural petty bourgeoisie, interwoven as it is with the peasants who live solely by the labor of their hands, was bound to strive for bourgeois reforms of a different kind, reforms that would leave far less room for medieval survivals. The wage workers, inasmuch as they consciously realized what was going on around them, were bound to work out for themselves a definite attitude toward this clash of two distinct tendencies. Both tendencies remained within the framework of the bourgeois system, determining entirely different forms of that system, entirely different rates of its development, different degrees of its progressive influence. Thus, the first period necessarily brought to the fore, and not by chance, those problems of Marxism which are usually referred to as problems of tactics. Nothing is more erroneous than the opinion that the disputes and differences over these questions were disputes among intellectuals, quote, a struggle for influence over the immature proletariat, an expression of the, quote, adaptation of the intelligentsia to the proletariat, as Vecchi followers of various hues think. On the contrary, it was precisely because this class had reached maturity that it could not remain indifferent to the clash of the two different tendencies in Russia's bourgeois development, and the ideologists of this class could not avoid providing theoretical formulations corresponding, directly or indirectly, in direct or reverse reflection to these different tendencies. In the second period, the clash between the different tendencies of bourgeois development in Russia was not on the order of the day, because both these tendencies had been crushed by the diehards, forced back, driven inwards, and for the time being stifled. The medieval diehards not only occupied the foreground, but also inspired the broadest sections of bourgeois society with the sentiments propagated by Vecchi, with a spirit of dejection and recantation. There's a footnote there. The diehards was the name given by Russian political literature to the extreme right-wing representatives of the reactionary landlord class. It was not the collision between two methods of reforming the old order that appeared on the surface, but a loss of faith in reforms of any kind, a spirit of meekness and repentance, an enthusiasm for antisocial doctrines, a vogue of mysticism, and so on. This astonishingly abrupt change was neither accidental nor the result of external pressure alone. The preceding period had so profoundly stirred up sections of the population who for generations and centuries had stood aloof from and had been strangers to political issues, that it was natural and inevitable that there should emerge, quote, a revaluation of all values, a new study of fundamental problems, a new interest in theory, in elementals, in the ABCs of politics. The millions who were suddenly awakened from their long sleep and confronted with extremely important problems could not long remain on this level. They couldn't continue without a respite, without a return to elementary questions, without a new training which would help them digest lessons of unparalleled richness and make it possible for incomparably wider masses again to march forward, but now far more firmly, more consciously, more confidently, and more steadfastly. The dialectics of historical development was such that in the first period, it was the attainment of immediate reforms in every sphere of the country's life that was on the order of the day. In the second period, it was the critical study of experience, its assimilation by wider sections, its penetration, so to speak, into the subsoil, into the backward ranks of the various classes. It is precisely because Marxism is not a lifeless dogma, not a completed, ready-made, immutable doctrine, but a living guide to action, that it was bound to reflect the astonishingly abrupt change in the conditions of social life. That change was reflected in profound disintegration and disunity, in every manner of vacillation, in short, in a very serious internal crisis of Marxism. Resolute resistance to this disintegration, a resolute and persistent struggle to uphold the fundamentals of Marxism, was again placed on the order of the day. In the preceding period, extremely wide sections of the classes that cannot avoid Marxism in formulating their aims had assimilated that doctrine in an extremely one-sided and mutilated fashion. They had learnt by rote certain slogans, certain answers to tactical questions, without having understood the Marxist criteria for these answers. The revaluation of all values in the various spheres of social life led to a revision of the most abstract and general philosophical fundamentals of Marxism. The influence of bourgeois philosophy, in its diverse idealist shades, found expression in the Machist epidemic that broke out among the Marxists. Commenting that's a reference to Ernst Mach, someone who Lenin didn't agree with that much. The repetition of slogans learned by rote, but not understood and not thought out, led to the widespread prevalence of empty phrasemongering. The practical expression of this were such absolutely un-Marxist, petty bourgeois trends as frank or shamefaced Otzevism, or the recognition of Otzevism as a legal shade of Marxism. On the other hand, the spirit of the magazine Vecchi, the spirit of renunciation, which had taken possession of very wide sections of the bourgeoisie, also permeated the trend wishing to confine Marxist theory and practice to moderate and careful channels. All that remained of Marxism here was the phraseology used to clothe arguments about hierarchy, hegemony, and so forth that were thoroughly permeated with the spirit of liberalism. Well, that sounds a little familiar. The purpose of this article is not to examine these arguments. A mere reference to them is sufficient to illustrate what has been said above regarding the depth of the crisis through which Marxism is passing and its connection with the whole social and economic situation in the present period. The questions raised by this crisis cannot be brushed aside. Nothing can be more pernicious or unprincipled than attempts to dismiss them by phrasemongering. Nothing is more important than to rally all Marxists who have realized the profundity of the crisis and the necessity of combating it, for defense of the theoretical basis of Marxism and its fundamental propositions that are being distorted from diametrically opposite sides by the spread of bourgeois influence to the various fellow travelers of Marxism. The first 3 years awakened wide sections to a conscious participation in social life, sections that, in many cases, are now for the first time beginning to acquaint themselves with Marxism in real earnest. The bourgeois press is creating far more fallacious ideas on this score than ever before, and is spreading them more widely. Under these circumstances, disintegration in the Marxist ranks is particularly dangerous. Therefore, to understand the reasons for the inevitability of this disintegration at the present time, and to close their ranks for consistent struggle against this disintegration is, in the most direct and precise meaning of the term, the task of the day for Marxists. So that's the end of the audiobook. There is a footnote here, which I didn't read before, about Zvezda. So it says, Zvezda, the Star, in which this article appeared, was a Bolshevik legal newspaper, the forerunner of Pravda, published in St. Petersburg from December 16, 1910 to April 22, 1912, at first weekly, then from January 1912 twice, and from March 3 times a week. On February 26, 1912, issue number 1 of Nevskaya Zvezda was published at the same time as Zvezda, and after the latter was closed down, continued its work. The last, the 27th issue of Nevskaya Zvezda was published on October 5, 1912. Contributors to Zvezda were N.N. Baturin, K.S. Yeremeyev, N.G. Poletayev, M.S. Olminsky, and others, including Maxim Gorky, whom Lenin enlisted as a contributor. The pro-party Mensheviks, Plekhanov's group, contributed to Zvezda until the autumn of 1911. Lenin gave the paper ideological leadership from abroad, and together Zvezda and Nevskaya Zvezda published nearly 50 of his articles. Under Lenin's guidance, the legal newspaper Zvezda became the militant paper of the Bolsheviks, which defended the program of the illegal party. Zvezda established workers' correspondence on a broad scale, maintaining strong and regular contact with the workers. Some of its issues achieved a circulation of 50,000 to 60,000 copies. The newspaper was the constant target of government repression. Out of 96 issues of Zvezda and Nevskaya Zvezda, 39 were confiscated and 10 were subject to fines. Zvezda paved the way for the publication of the daily Bolshevik newspaper Pravda, and on the very day it was closed down by the government, the first issue of Pravda appeared. All right, so that's the end of everything, footnotes included. What did you think? Leave a comment below. We'll continue the discussion in the comments. Otherwise, thanks for listening. Thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month. Every donation is encouraging. They're also materially helpful, so thank you very much for that. I really do appreciate them. If you'd like to help out without making a donation, liking, commenting, subscribing, clicking the notifications bell, and sharing the videos on your social media, particularly on Facebook, where we have no presence right now, is much appreciated and gets these videos in front of more eyeballs and expands the conversation. Otherwise, thanks for whatever you do online and in your community for spreading the ideas of socialism. Join an organization if there's a good one in your area, and we'll catch you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the June 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of L.N. Tolstoy and the Modern Labor Movement from 1910 by Lenin. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. We're also on SoundCloud at soundcloud.com/socialisms4a, where you can download MP3 versions of these works. So, I mentioned that this is being recorded for the June 2022 edition of Socialism for All. Specifically, today is Friday, June 24th, 2022, and it was just announced this morning that the U.S. Supreme Court has overturned the Roe v. Wade decision from the early 1970s, which made abortion federally legal in the United States. With that overturned, it's now on a state-to-state basis, and many U.S. states have very restrictive laws regarding abortion. Some it's completely illegal, some there's a 6-week ban where you can't get an abortion after that, etc. It is really bad news. This is not good for the working class, half of whom roughly have uteruses. It is about power. It's about creating a vulnerable working class, more vulnerable working class, and also creating a large army of unemployed, which helps to keep wages down. Those are some of the reasons for this move. The right wing has been organizing furiously for decades, the left not so much, and this needs to change immediately. It has been changing somewhat over the last few years. It now needs to go into hyperdrive. We need to hit critical mass. This thing needs to start snowballing. Specifically, anyone in the US left needs to know, you need to be able to recite it in your sleep. The Democratic Party is not reformable, and it's not an appropriate venue for US workers to organize in. They're an imperialist party. They take money hand over fist from big banks and insurance companies and every other enemy of the working class. When you organize a workers' party, the party needs to be a multi-purpose organizing hub, not just for electoral politics, which is just one slice of it, but for engaging in class struggle in all different arenas, really whatever is going to be effective. Labor unions, tenant unions, community organizing of all types. And you need to do that within a hub that is free of bourgeois or capitalist influence. The Democratic Party is never going to be that. It is capitalist influenced, capitalist dominated, top to bottom, even down to the very local level. So you will hear opportunistic sock Dems sometimes saying, oh, we got to run as Dems because that's how you win. No, you don't really win anything. Even if you win an election, you lose the overall struggle because you're not building anything. It's about building a workers' party that is a multi-purpose organizing hub for a many-faceted class struggle. Again, the Democratic Party is never going to be that. Just see the Bernie Sanders run, the attempt at gate crashing. It's never going to be transformed into that, ever. So we do need that, though, but we have to build it ourselves. No one's going to hand it to us. So just so happens that the fourth largest political party in the United States is the Green Party. And they do meet the minimum criteria for this, and there are other left parties as well. But basically things like not taking corporate money and putting large transformational demands on the system that probably the system cannot fully deliver on, but that's the point. You want to get as much as you possibly can in terms of reform out of the system and use those reforms as propaganda that we need to keep pushing, that the system is going to hold us back, and that eventually, after we've done a lot of organizing and agitation and gotten more out of the system and formed a competent and powerful counterpower to the currently, very well organized, wealthy and powerful capitalists who are the dominant power. Well, after we've done all that and gotten very strong, organized, mobilized people by the tens of millions to this cause, where they're thinking about it every day, they've internalized it, they're writing about it, they're talking about it, etc., that's when people become really receptive to, we need to completely abolish capitalism, this entire system and everything attached to it. You can't really start at that point. I mean, you can obviously explain it to people, but you need to build up momentum to where that can actually become a reality. There needs to be a revolutionary buildup. Now, we're at the beginning of that process. People are still kind of hemming and hawing. Some of the early adopters are doing more in terms of forming unions and joining parties and getting organized. That's really good. We're still not at critical mass at this point, so we've really got to do a lot of agitation around getting people to break out of the long-standing pattern. I say that basically the US left has two modes. One, trying to reform the Democratic Party, and then two, dropping out and doing nothing. Well, that can't be an option anymore. It's got to be realizing that the Democratic Party can't be reformed and that it's just going to keep delivering more failure, loss, tragedy, and destruction to the working class, and not dropping out and doing nothing, but getting organized. Again, Green Party, minimum starting point. And there are other left parties as well, whatever you feel like is the next step for you. That's how we move beyond just memes. That's how we bring this to life in the real world. That's what needs to happen as fast as humanly possible. So, what I will say is, these are difficult times. There's a lot of bad news. And it is disturbing to see how much US Americans will accept without pushing back. There are many reasons for this. One of them, for example, white America often doesn't care about what happens to Black America. Straight America doesn't always care about what happens to LGBTQ plus America. Documented America doesn't always care about undocumented America, and so on. In other words, there hasn't necessarily been the best class solidarity across all of these other lines. And then when the topic does come up, a lot of times it's people from the more dominant status, whatever it is, telling the relatively less empowered people to basically suck it up and just, do what they say. That's not solidarity. That's just bringing bourgeois oppression and prejudice into the working class movement. It's not helpful. Anyway, while these have historically been a lot of problems, and it does concern me how much the US will just sit there and take, there is truly a new, emerging, post-boomer, radical revolutionary consciousness that shines in times like this. When news like this comes out, you see the outcry, you see the outrage. It is good, and it wasn't here 10 or 20 years ago, not in the same way. But it needs to be amplified by organizations. It needs to be harnessed, pulled together in ways that are effective, and not just left to rot on the vine. It's got to come together into useful, organized activity that is planned and strategic and is capable of actually inflicting damage on this system. It is within our grasp to do it. People are already starting to do it. I just think that this is one of the most important things to harp on for anybody who hasn't yet. It needs to be your priority. Believe me, the orgs want to hear from you. When you're in an org and you're doing the email or phone or social media for an organization, all you want is people to contact you. They want, operators are standing by. In other words, just say, hi, I'm a leftist, I'm a socialist, I am interested in helping build your party, what can I do? Believe me, they will tell you. All right, so I think that's enough for intro comments right now. Let's get to today's short reading, and then we'll come back and discuss. Basically, I chose this because there's a great quote about despair from Lenin here, and why revolutionary proletarians should not. So, again, the title is L.N. Tolstoy and the Modern Labor Movement. It was first published in Nash Put, number 7, November 28, 1910. Published according to that text. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1974, Moscow, Volume 16. HTML transcription and markup by R. Simbala, and it is in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive at marxists.org. Fantastic resource, go check them out. Let's get into the text. The Russian workers in practically all the large cities of Russia have already made their response in connection with the death of L.N. Tolstoy, and in one way or another expressed their attitude to the writer who produced a number of most remarkable works of art that put him in the ranks of the great writers of the world, and to the thinker who, with immense power, self-confidence, and sincerity, raised a number of questions concerning the basic features of the modern political and social system. All in all, this attitude was expressed in the telegram, printed in the newspapers, which was sent by the labor deputies in the Third Duma. There's a footnote there. This refers to the telegram sent to Ostapovo by the Social Democratic or Marxist deputies of the Third Duma, which is the Russian parliament, to V.G. Chertkov, a close friend and disciple of L.N. Tolstoy. Quote, the Social Democratic grout in the Duma, expressing the feelings of the Russian and the whole international proletariat, deeply mourns the loss of the brilliant artist, the irreconcilable and unconquered fighter against official clericalism, the enemy of tyranny and enslavement, who loudly raised his voice against the death penalty, the friend of the persecuted. Unquote. Back to the text. L. Tolstoy began his literary career when serfdom still existed, but at a time when it had already obviously come to the end of its days. Tolstoy's main activity falls in that period of Russian history which lies between two of its turning points, 1861 and 1905. Throughout this period, traces of serfdom, direct survivals of it, permeated the whole economic, particularly in the countryside, and political life of the country. And at the same time, this was a period of the accelerated growth of capitalism from below and its implantation from above. In what were the survivals of serfdom expressed? Most of all, and clearest of all, in the fact that in Russia, mainly an agricultural country, Agriculture at that time was in the hands of a ruined, impoverished peasantry who were working with antiquated, primitive methods on the old feudal allotments, which had been cut in 1861 for the benefit of the landlords. And, on the other hand, agriculture was in the hands of the landlords who in central Russia cultivated the land by the labor, the wooden plows, and the horses of the peasants in return for the, quote, cut-off lands, meadows, access to watering places, etc. To all intents and purposes, this was the old feudal system of economy. Throughout this period, the political system of Russia was also permeated with feudalism. This is evident from the constitution of the state prior to the first moves to change it in 1905, from the predominant influence of the landed nobility on state affairs, and from the unlimited power of the officials, who also, for the most part, especially the higher ranks, came from the landed nobility. Quick note about dates here. So this is written in 1910, which was pretty much dead in the middle between the First Russian Revolution, 1905. Lenin just referenced here the first moves to change the constitution of the state, and the 1917 revolution. There were actually two revolutions in 1917, the February Revolution, when the Tsar was overthrown, and then following that, the capitalists set up a provisional government, which they dominated, and then the October Revolution, just less than a year later, when the Bolsheviks took power. So that provisional government following the Tsar was not around for long. Continuing. After 1861, this old patriarchal Russia began rapidly to disintegrate under the influence of world capitalism. The peasants were starving, dying off, and being ruined as never before, fleeing to the towns and abandoning the soil. There was a boom in the construction of railways, mills, and factories, thanks to the cheap labor of these ruined peasants. Big finance capital was developing in Russia together with large-scale commerce and industry. It was this rapid, painful, drastic demolition of all the old pillars of old Russia that was reflected in the works of Tolstoy the artist and in the views of Tolstoy the thinker. Tolstoy had a surpassing knowledge of rural Russia, the mode of life of the landlords and peasants. In his artistic productions, he gave descriptions of this life that are numbered among the best productions of world literature. The drastic demolition of all the old pillars of rural Russia sharpened his attention, deepened his interest in what was going on around him, and led to a radical change in his whole world outlook. By birth and education, Tolstoy belonged to the highest landed nobility in Russia. He broke with all the customary views of this environment, and in his later works attacked with fierce criticism all the contemporary state, church, social, and economic institutions which were based on enslavement of the masses, on their poverty, on the ruin of the peasants and the petty proprietors in general, on the coercion and hypocrisy which permeated all contemporary life from top to bottom. Tolstoy's criticism was not new. He said nothing that had not been said long before him, both in European and in Russian literature, by friends of the working people. But the uniqueness of Tolstoy's criticism and its historical significance lie in the fact that it expressed, with a power such as is possessed only by artists of genius, the radical change in the views of the broadest masses of the people in the Russia of this period, namely rural peasant Russia. For Tolstoy's criticism of contemporary institutions differs from the criticism of the same institutions by representatives of the modern labor movement in the fact that Tolstoy's point of view was that of the patriarchal, naive peasant, whose psychology Tolstoy introduced into his criticism and his doctrine. Tolstoy's criticism is marked by such emotional power, such passion, convincingness, freshness, sincerity, and fearlessness in striving to go to the roots, to find the real cause of the afflictions of the masses, just because this criticism really expresses a sharp change in the ideas of millions of peasants who had only just emerged from feudalism into freedom, and saw that this freedom meant new horrors of ruin, death by starvation, a homeless life among the lower strata of the city population, so on and so forth. Comment. It's like when libertarians are always talking about freedom to be homeless. Yeah, that's capitalism. So, I mean, in this context, you have peasants who, for generations, time immemorial, have lived off the land. This is a radical change, going to an urban environment, trying to work for wages, completely different. Continuing. Tolstoy mirrored their sentiments so faithfully that he imported their naivete into his own doctrine, their alienation from political life, their mysticism, their desire to keep aloof from the world, non-resistance to evil, their impotent imprecations against capitalism and the power of money, the protest of millions of peasants and their desperation. These were combined in Tolstoy's doctrine. The representatives of the modern labor movement find that they have plenty to protest against, but nothing to despair about. Despair is typical of the classes which are perishing, but the class of wage workers is growing inevitably, developing and becoming strong in every capitalist society, Russia included. Despair is typical of those who do not understand the causes of evil, see no way out, and are incapable of struggle. The modern industrial proletariat does not belong to the category of such classes. So that's the end of the audiobook. What is Lenin saying here in the conclusion? So he's contrasting the representatives of the modern labor movement, the modern in this case being 1910, against the earlier, 30, 40, 50 years prior peasant movement. So the peasant class was dying, in other words. The entire way of life, the economic system that supported peasants living where they lived and being peasants and all that kind of stuff, like all the activity that they engaged in and that they built their lives around. That economic system was being upended, and so they were moving to the cities and being confronted with dirty, noisy, ugly environments that were not, living out in the countryside and all that kind of stuff. Their class was dying, and so that's reflected in Tolstoy's works, and that is the perspective of a class which is getting subsumed into the proletariat. In other words, these peasants were being proletarianized, as we say, and they were not adjusted to that. They didn't really see themselves as proletarians. They still carried the worldview of a peasant now forced to live in the proletarian way of life. That sort of upending of all the social norms and everything, the habits, the customs that you're used to, really plunge you into kind of a despairing, confused, in sociology we sometimes say anomic, a concept called anomie, normlessness, when just your sense of what is normal gets completely disrupted. What is socially expected of you, what you do, in other words. Being in that anomic state, very uncomfortable, can really lead to people being dislocated, and is connected with a study on suicide to give you some idea of how deeply this can impact people in a negative way. But Lenin is saying here that despair is typical of the classes which are perishing, but the class of wage workers is growing, developing, and becoming strong. So, continuing the quote, despair is typical of those who do not understand the causes of evil, see no way out, and are incapable of struggle. Now, we see a lot of this in the United States today. A lot of despair. I think it's safe to say that in the United States, there is a lack of understanding of the causes of these problems. There are a lot of people who see no way out, who, for example, think that just voting Democrat more and more is going to somehow do it. That is going to definitely lead to despair, and are incapable of struggle. So again, this is what I'm saying, get organized, get involved in some organized struggle. It may be spontaneous at first, but it's got to become progressively more strategic, planned, and productive in the end. So despair is typical of those who do not understand the causes of evil, see no way out from them, and are incapable of struggle against them. Lenin concludes by saying the modern industrial proletariat, in other words, class-conscious workers who have adjusted to that status, embraced it, and see that the future belongs to the proletariat. They do not belong to the category of such classes, which are despairing and everything else. When you become class-conscious and you see that the proletariat is the definite heir to this entire world that we are building under the capitalists, well, then that's not a cause to despair at all. We have a lot to gain. We have a future, but we do have to fight for it. So unlike the peasants who feel that they had just lost everything, etc., they did not really understand their new class position, etc., and that's what was reflected in the works of Tolstoy. As we move on into the 20th century and Marxism takes hold and you get parties like the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party and other solid Marxist parties and leaders like Lenin spreading these kinds of writings and doing this kind of teaching, well, then we get workers who understand what the stakes are. And if you're new to all this, in Marxism we have something called historical materialism. Basically this says that ever since class society, which is an unequal type of society started a number of thousands of years ago. Most of human history, we lived as hunter-gatherers, where there was very little technology, if any. There was very little sort of stores of food or property from year to year. People were nomadic and, again, mainly lived hunter-gatherer, maybe a tiny bit of agriculture here and there. That was an egalitarian, communitarian type of society where everybody had to work and everybody got equal spoils, because the group needed everyone's labor in order to survive, and so people were treated as equals. And this was kind of the way that humanity existed, sort of, quote, naturally for most of our history. However, whatever it is, 10,000 years ago, class society starts, quote, civilization, and we develop an unequal society that builds up property and builds up technology and builds up stores of food, etc. And then there become questions about unequal division, who rules the society, who works in the society, and so on. And this has taken different forms over time. There was the early slave states, there was feudalism, there is currently capitalism, and socialism, which is attempting to emerge out of capitalism now. What is key about socialism versus capitalism is that capitalism and everything before it, it's a minoritarian ruled society. So the ruling class is a minority class. Now, capitalism was progressive versus feudalism in terms of, instead of just a few royals governing feudal society, capitalism had a broader ruling class, but it was still a small minority of the overall population, which exploited the rest of the population. But in that process, running capitalism in a society, it creates the next class, which is up and coming. Just like feudalism created capitalists, capitalism is creating what? The proletariat. Because basically over time, two great classes emerged. The capitalists, who are few in numbers but great in terms of their property, and the proletariat, who don't have much property but are the overwhelming majority of society. The sort of, crudely expressed in the decent phrase, now a standard, household term, the 99% and the 1%. It's actually a bit more complicated than that, but that's a decent starting point. The thing about socialism is that all it takes is for the working people, who are the overwhelming majority of society, and actually created, this class was created by capitalism and the property relations initiated by capitalism, just have to organize, to combine, and get rid of the capitalists and abolish the system, abolish the private property that capitalism is created on, and all of that previously privately held industrial property, all the workplaces, all the factories, all the restaurants, everything, the raw materials, so on and so on. Well, abolish that private property status, make it collective property, and move forward into socialism, which is the first time that the ruling class is also the majority of society. And from there, you start to build socialism on day one of the revolution. For a time, some of the contradictions and inequalities left over from capitalism still persist. That early socialist society is still stamped with the characteristics of the capitalism which gave birth to it. But as the revolutionary society proceeds, you iron them out, and you complete the process of proletarianization by proletarianizing even the capitalists. Eventually, everyone is one class, which is another way to say there are no classes anymore. So it is a classless, eventually stateless, as all of those bugs get worked out, and the government of that society becomes less about managing people and more just about running the industry, which of course has its own logic to it, which no matter what you might want it to be, you have to obey that. That's what Engels' On Authority is about. If you're planting crops, you can't just plant them in the dead of winter, they won't grow. So in a certain sense, we are slaves of industry here on this material plane, but on the other hand, the way that we organize human society is within our grasp, and we can eventually cast off the parasites who would have us just work for them. It's bad enough to be stuck here on Earth having to do all the things that we have to do to materially exist and survive. It's even worse to be enslaved by someone who is, biologically your equal for really no good reason. This is the struggle against capitalism, against wage slavery. So, about despair. In closing, We went through this in the 2020 election. Big topic, first year of the channel. One of the things that I said then is all the anxiety that the Democrats put out, this is their anxiety. It's not ours. You know, their struggle with the Republicans, these different factions of the capitalist class, which at the end of the day, they're on the same page. Their interests align on virtually everything. They just, you know, there are certain little divisions within their class about how best to do what they're doing. But their interests are not our interests. So we should not pick up their anxiety. Just like the dying classes, they despair because they see no future ahead. We are the proletariat. We have a future. Again, we have to fight for it. And you have to know what the causes are and how to struggle for it, just as Lenin said. And we need to do that because, you know, I think that why there's so much despair going around in a place like the United States, other US influenced places of a similar type, is, first of all, that the workers, you know, don't really understand capitalism, don't really know what's going on. Although more and more people are having a conversation about that, getting educated about it. That's why we're doing this channel here, so that people can learn about it in an accessible way and learn how to struggle against it so that we can claim the future that is coming to us. And also, a lot of it is this sort of Stockholm syndrome, you know, referred anxiety and referred despair that is given to us by the sort of dying liberal faction of the capitalist class. You know, all the people who talk about how, you know, oh, our democracy is on the brink. The United States is an oligarchy, not a democracy. This was proved by the Princeton study on democracy. It isn't a democracy. It is just ruled by the rich, period. Workers really have nothing to gain by perpetuating it. Now, with a caveat, you want to use the freedoms afforded by bourgeois society to their utmost in order to advance the struggle. But you don't just appreciate them sort of in and of themselves as just daily life. You have to exploit them to advance our interests as workers, which are not in keeping the system around. It's an important point for people to understand because, again, use the freedoms afforded by bourgeois society to fight for socialism, but don't just stand around and sort of, you know, fight for that version of capitalism in and of itself as your end goal. Not at all. But let me also, and I'm going to end on this, throw in a third possibility as far as the source of this despair. And I guess it kind of ties in with that sort of, you know, dying, watered down left liberalism of the Democratic Party. But the dying middle class, the dying social chauvinist middle class that has ridden on the spoils of imperialism within the United States for a long time, finding that that increased standard of living, this way of life of living off of the many countries which the United States militarily and economically dominates around the world, that even that is no longer providing a good life in the United States anymore. Those super profits are not being shared with the working class, and that, quote, middle class, which is just a labor aristocracy elevated out of the US working class to create the illusion that, you know, we're not being exploited as much as we are, etc. That is creating some despair as well. People seeing that come to an end, and, you know, this is like all the discussion about, quote, we're becoming a third world country, very sort of condescending, classist way of looking at the countries that your country has actually been exploiting to prop you up. So I think that there is some of that sort of dying middle class despair. And you see people like Liz Warren trying to do political messaging off of that still. There's no saving the middle class. Also, we should not save it. That is the socialist point of view. What we want is socialist abolition of capitalism, leading to international cooperation among the working people of the entire earth. No more classes, not more middle class. More middle class is not the goal. Having a good life is a goal, yes, but not within the context of maintaining class society, which people like Liz Warren, etc., are certainly out to try to hang on to and maintain. When we say class society, we're talking about capitalism. We want to end that. They do not. The best that Liz Warren, though, is going to give you is sort of a green militarism, as she was advertising in the 2020 Democratic primaries, that, you know, we can keep the middle class strong. We can keep dominating the rest of the world, getting all these super profits from other countries that we're imperialistically exploiting, and then we'll keep feeding those to the middle class. No, we need to end class society and initiate an era of international proletarian-led cooperation. That can only proceed with capitalists out of the picture, out of power, their activities suppressed, and that's how we're actually going to be able to solve problems that are really making people despair. The plastic in the oceans, the climate crisis, which is already an extinction crisis for many species. It's not the only source of an extinction crisis for many species, but it is a major one that could easily get completely out of control very fast, and could also become an extinction event for humans as well. So understand the causes, see the way out, and become capable of struggle. Those of us who get it and are doing this stuff, we really just need more people to show up and get involved. That's how we're going to turn this around. Get organized, make the demands, whatever they are. Abolish the Supreme Court, abolish the Senate, abolish any institutions which are not democratic, pave the way towards actual workers' democracy, worker control, not just capitalist democracy where 1% or 2% or 5% of the population really has all the political power. Get organized and make the demands. Take them to the streets, pick up momentum, pull more people into the movement. Again, we need to be mobilizing tens of millions of people, and we can do it, but not if we stay joined at the hip with the capitalist parties, and if we don't organize independently for ourselves, and then engage in every form of class struggle which is available to us and will be effective. We have to do it. So I'm going to leave this there for now. What do you think? There's a lot going on. Do you have a question? Do you have a comment? Leave it in the comments section. We'll continue the discussion there as always. Specifically on the abortion rights being overturned in the United States, I just want to say, look up the Plan C pill. P-L-A-N-C. Like Plan A, Plan B, Plan C. There is, I believe the website is plancpills.org, and there's a lot of information there. These are safe, obtainable by mail after a telehealth consultation. Way to end a pregnancy up to 10 weeks. So there are some options that people can get their hands on now, whatever is coming down the pipeline. So anyway, we'll probably continue on that. I'll also put a link to a recent video that I did about abortion rights in the US. Thanks again for listening, and thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month or more, whatever you see fit. Every donation is encouraging. They're also materially helpful, and they've allowed me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I would have been able to do otherwise. We don't run ads on the channel. It's non-commercial. So that support is really vital and much appreciated. Thanks to all the patrons. Otherwise, after the content's been created and uploaded, engagement counts. So liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting, even if it's thanks or good video, all of that's great. We do love to see a good discussion going, not a debate, but just a discussion. People actually want to learn things and are coming in good faith to learn them. We want to see, again, tens of millions of people involved in this movement. This channel is one port of entry into it, and we want to help to usher in as many people as we possibly can. So do reach out. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the October 2022 edition of Socialism for All. It's an audiobook and discussion of In Memory of the Commune by Lenin from 1911. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this piece was published in Robochia Gazeta, number 4 and 5, April 15, 1911, published here according to that text. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1974, Moscow, Volume 17, translated by Dora Cox, HTML transcription and markup by R. Simbala, and it's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive, marxists.org. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. So let's get into it. 40 years have passed since the proclamation of the Paris Commune. In accordance with tradition, the French workers paid homage to the memory of the men and women of the Revolution of March 18, 1871, by meetings and demonstrations. At the end of May, they will again place wreaths on the graves of the communards who were shot, the victims of the terrible May Week, and over their graves they will once more vow to fight untiringly until their ideas have triumphed and the cause they bequeath has been fully achieved. Why does the proletariat, not only in France but throughout the entire world, honor the men and women of the Paris Commune as their predecessors? And what is the heritage of the Commune? The Commune sprang up spontaneously. No one consciously prepared it in an organized way. The unsuccessful war with Germany, the privations suffered during the siege, the unemployment among the proletariat, and the ruin among the lower middle classes, the indignation of the masses against the upper classes, and against authorities who had displayed utter incompetence, the vague unrest among the working class, which was discontented with its lot and was striving for a different social system, the reactionary composition of the National Assembly, which roused apprehensions as to the fate of the Republic. All this and many other factors combined to drive the population of Paris to revolution on March 18, which unexpectedly placed power in the hands of the National Guard, in the hands of the working class and the petty bourgeoisie, which had sided with it. It was an event unprecedented in history. Up to that time, power had, as a rule, been in the hands of landowners and capitalists, i.e., in the hands of their trusted agents who made up the so-called government. After the revolution of March 18, when Monsieur Thiers' government had fled from Paris with its troops, its police, and its officials, the people became masters of the situation, and power passed into the hands of the proletariat. But in modern society, the proletariat, economically enslaved by capital, cannot dominate politically unless it breaks the chains which fetter it to capital. That is why the movement of the Commune was bound to take on a socialist tinge, i.e. to strive to overthrow the rule of the bourgeoisie, the rule of capital, and to destroy the very foundations of the contemporary social order. At first, this movement was extremely indefinite and confused. It was joined by patriots who hoped that the Commune would renew the war with the Germans and bring it to a successful conclusion. It enjoyed the support of the small shopkeepers who were threatened with ruin unless there was a postponement of payments on debts and rent. The government refused to grant this postponement, but they obtained it from the Commune. Finally, it enjoyed at first the sympathy of bourgeois Republicans who feared that the reactionary National Assembly, the rustics, the savage landlords, would restore the monarchy. But it was, of course, the workers, especially the artisans of Paris, among whom active socialist propaganda had been carried on during the last years of the Second Empire, and many of whom even belonged to the International, who played the principal part in this movement. Only the workers remained loyal to the Commune to the end. The bourgeois Republicans and the petty bourgeoisie soon broke away from it. The former were frightened off by the revolutionary socialist, proletarian character of the movement. The latter broke away when they saw that it was doomed to inevitable defeat. Only the French proletarians supported their government fearlessly and untiringly. They alone fought and died for it. That is to say, for the cause of the emancipation of the working class, for a better future for all toilers. Deserted by its former allies and left without support, the Commune was doomed to defeat. The entire bourgeoisie of France, all the landlords, stockbrokers, factory owners, all the robbers, great and small, all the exploiters, joined forces against it. This bourgeois coalition, supported by Bismarck, who released 100,000 French prisoners of war to help crush revolutionary Paris, succeeded in rousing the ignorant peasants and the petty bourgeoisie of the provinces against the proletariat of Paris, and forming a ring of steel around half of Paris. The other half was besieged by the German army. In some of the larger cities in France, Marseille, Lyon, Saint-Étienne, Dijon, etc., the workers also attempted to seize power, proclaim the Commune, and come to the help of Paris. But these attempts were short-lived. Paris, which had first raised the banner of proletarian revolt, was left to its own resources and doomed to certain destruction. Two conditions at least are necessary for a victorious social revolution: highly developed productive forces and a proletariat adequately prepared for it. But in 1871, both these conditions were lacking. French capitalism was still poorly developed, and France was at that time mainly a petty bourgeois country: artisans, peasants, shopkeepers, etc. On the other hand, there was no workers' party. The working class had not gone through a long school of struggle and was unprepared, and for the most part did not even clearly visualize its tasks and the methods of fulfilling them. There was no serious political organization of the proletariat, nor were there strong trade unions and cooperative societies. But the chief thing which the Commune lacked was time, an opportunity to take stock of the situation and to embark upon the fulfillment of its program. It had scarcely had time to start war when the government, entrenched in Versailles and supported by the entire bourgeoisie, began hostilities against Paris. The Commune had to concentrate primarily on self-defense. Right up to the very end, May 21st to 28, it had no time to think seriously of anything else. However, in spite of these unfavorable conditions, in spite of its brief existence, the Commune managed to promulgate a few measures which sufficiently characterize its real significance and aims. The Commune did away with the standing army, that blind weapon in the hands of the ruling classes, and it armed the whole people. It proclaimed the separation of church and state, abolished state payments to religious bodies, i.e. state salaries for priests, made popular education purely secular, and in this way struck a severe blow at the gendarmes and Catholics. In the purely social sphere, the Commune accomplished very little, but this nevertheless clearly reveals its character as a popular workers' government. Night work in bakeries was forbidden. The system of fines, which represented legalized robbery of the workers, was abolished. Finally, there was the famous decree that all factories and workshops abandoned or shut down by their owners were to be turned over to associations of workers that were to resume production. And as if to emphasize its character as a truly democratic, proletarian government, the Commune decreed that the salaries of all administrative and government officials, irrespective of rank, should not exceed the normal wages of a worker, and in no case amount to more than 6,000 francs a year, or less than 200 rubles a month. All these measures showed clearly enough that the Commune was a deadly menace to the old world founded on the enslavement and exploitation of the people. That was why bourgeois society could not feel at ease so long as the red flag of the proletariat waved over the Hôtel de Ville in Paris. And when the organized forces of the government finally succeeded in gaining the upper hand over the poorly organized forces of the revolution, the Bonapartist generals who had been beaten by the Germans and who showed courage only in fighting their defeated countrymen, those French Lenin and Miller-Zakomelskis, Tsarist generals known for their brutal, punitive actions during the 1905 to 1907 revolution, organized such a slaughter as Paris had never known. About 30,000 Parisians were shot down by the bestial soldiery, and about 45,000 were arrested, many of whom were afterwards executed, while thousands were transported or exiled. In all, Paris lost about 100,000 of its best people, including some of the finest workers in all trades. The bourgeoisie were satisfied. Now we've finished with socialism for a long time, said their leader, the bloodthirsty dwarf Thiers, after he and his generals had drowned the proletariat of Paris in blood. But these bourgeois crows croaked in vain. Less than 6 years after the suppression of the Commune, when many of its champions were still pining in prison or in exile, a new working class movement arose in France, a new socialist generation, enriched by the experience of their predecessors and no whit discouraged by their defeat, picked up the flag which had fallen from the hands of the fighters in the cause of the Commune and bore it boldly and confidently forward. Their battle cry was, "Long live the social revolution, long live the Commune." And in another few years, the new Workers' Party and the agitational work launched by it throughout the country compelled the ruling classes to release communards who were still kept in prison by the government. The memory of the fighters of the Commune is honored not only by the workers of France, but by the proletariat of the whole world. For the Commune fought, not for some local or narrow national aim, but for the emancipation of all toiling humanity, of all the downtrodden and oppressed. As a foremost fighter for the social revolution, the Commune has won sympathy wherever there is a proletariat suffering and engaged in struggle. The epic of its life and death, the sight of a workers' government which seized the capital of the world and held it for over 2 months, the spectacle of the heroic struggle of the proletariat, and the torments it underwent after its defeat, all this raised the spirit of millions of workers, aroused their hopes, and enlisted their sympathy for the cause of socialism. The thunder of the cannon in Paris awakened the most backward sections of the proletariat from their deep slumber, and everywhere gave impetus to the growth of revolutionary socialist propaganda. That is why the cause of the Commune is not dead. It lives to the present day in every one of us. The cause of the Commune is the cause of the social revolution, the cause of the complete political and economic emancipation of the toilers. It is the cause of the proletariat of the whole world, and in this sense, it is immortal. That's the end of the audiobook. So that was a very inspiring piece by Lenin, I think, and The point to me is you win some, you lose some, but even the losses can spur you forward, sharpen class consciousness, inspire other oppressed workers to go, I could do that. Maybe next time we'll go all the way. I think that inaction begets inaction, and action oftentimes begets action. Now, you can't be adventurous and get way, way ahead of the masses, but I think that that's not really primarily the error that is plaguing the working class of the United States or Europe or anywhere that capitalism is very advanced. I think that there's a lot of right opportunism and tailing the bourgeoisie at a time when really workers are ready to press forward. Are workers ready for a Paris Commune Part 2? That maybe remains to be seen, but I wouldn't underestimate people. There's a lot of anger out there, and while some of it is getting channeled into reactionary, right-wing, quote, pseudo-populist or right-wing populist, basically fascist things, there's also this sense that things are just never going to get better the way that they are, and people have the sense to realize that obviously, right-wing populism or fascism isn't going to make anything better either, that really that's the sort of, quote, alternative being presented. People are starting to explore other options. It's why people are subscribing to channels like this and others that are like it. So I think that the main question is, can we connect that anger and that sense that things are not going to get better on their own with the lessons and theory and all the instructions of the past of Marxism-Leninism, of successful rebellions. Obviously, we're in somewhat different technological circumstances in 2022, but the class interests are basically very similar. In fact, if anything, the proletariat is much, much larger now. The amount of people who don't own any capital, have to sell their labor to a capitalist in order to get by in life, that is bigger than ever. And again, it's a matter of time, I think, as people work through the sort of process of elimination of, well, we tried the Democrats, we tried this, we tried that, before people come around to what's been sitting here the whole time, which is that capitalism needs to be abolished, and there's a well thought out system of philosophy and historical practice for that kind of revolutionary radical social change that just needs to be picked up again, sharpened, and put back into practice. So anyway, what do you think? Leave a question or comment below. We'll continue the discussion there as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. Patreon.com/socialismforall if you'd like to get your name on the screen. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month or more. I would make content even if nobody supported, but I'm able to spend a lot more time on it and produce a larger quantity of content when people are supporting, so hugely appreciated there. Thank you. Every donation is encouraging and also materially helpful. Then engagement counts, whether you're a patron or not. Like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment, even if it's just a good video or thanks. All of that helps YouTube to boost this content, to recommend it to more people. So if you want more people to see this content, do engage with it. That matters. Then finally, of course, join the struggle in your area, whether it's an anti-capitalist political party, labor union, community union, tenant union, whatever it is. Find the struggle where it's going on, support it, get involved. Your experiences with that in the real world are going to dovetail with whatever readings and historical studies you're doing, and you'll be able both to apply the history better and understand the history better from your own experience. All right, thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the June 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of economic and political strikes by Lenin from 1912. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this piece was published in Nevskaya Zvezda number 10, May 31st, 1912. Published according to that newspaper text, verified with the text in the Symposium, Marxism and Liquidationism, Part 2, St. Petersburg, 1914. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1975, Moscow, Volume 18. Translated by Stepan Apresian, HTML transcription and markup by R. Sambala, and it's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive at the Marxists Internet Archive, marxists.org. So before we begin the text, I want to just address one topic that we haven't talked about a lot on the channel, which is mentioned in here, and that's liquidationism. So back before the October Revolution in 1917, when the Bolsheviks took power in Russia, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, and at that time Social Democratic meant Marxist, had been organizing for a long time, and it had different wings within the party, or different branches. The Bolsheviks were one wing, and it contained people like Lenin and Stalin, and the Mensheviks were another wing, and they frequently engaged in opportunism, one example of which was liquidationism. Basically, when you are waging a revolutionary struggle, there are legal forms of struggle and there are illegal forms of struggle. And really, the dividing line on that is just set by the bourgeois government, because the bourgeoisie makes the laws, and then parts of your struggle are going to be deemed illegal, parts of your struggle are going to be deemed legal, but it doesn't mean that one is more necessary than the other. The majority of the Bolsheviks believed that both illegal and legal forms of struggle were necessary. Makes sense. But the liquidationists wanted to purge any elements of illegal activity, and they even questioned the need, some of them, for the RSDLP at all. So basically, liquidationism is taking what you think is the good part of the party, your part of the party, and wanting to just liquidate everything other than it. So I mentioned Menshevik liquidationism, and it usually is Mensheviks and Bundists who get mentioned in this context. There were also a few Bolsheviks who wanted to sort of do like reverse liquidationism and purge the Mensheviks or something like that. Again, Lenin was not in favor of this, so he wrote a lot against it, struggled against it, and you will hear references to that in this piece. All right, let's begin the text. Ever since 1905, the official strike statistics kept by the Ministry of Commerce and Industry have subdivided strikes into economic and political. This subdivision was necessitated by reality, which has evolved distinctive forms of the strike movement. The combination of economic and political strike is one of the main features of these forms, and now there is a revival of the strike movement. It is in the interest of a scientific analysis, of an intelligent attitude to events, that the workers should look closely into this distinctive feature of the strike movement in Russia. To begin with, we shall cite several basic figures taken from the government strike statistics. For 3 years, 1905 to 1907, the strike movement in Russia kept at a height unprecedented in the world. Government statistics cover only factories, so that mining, railways, building, and numerous other branches of wage labor are left out. But even in factories alone, the number of strikers was 2,863,000, or a little less than 3 million in 1905. 1,108,000 in 1906, and 740,000 in 1907. In the 15 years from 1894 to 1908, during which strike statistics began to be systematically studied in Europe, the greatest number of strikers for 1 year, 660,000, was registered in America. Consequently, the Russian workers were the first in the world to develop the strike struggle on the mass scale that we witnessed in 1905 to 1907. Now it is the British workers who have lent a new great impetus to the strike movement with regard to economic strikes. The Russian workers owe their leading role not to greater strength, better organization, or higher development compared with the workers in Western Europe, but to the fact that so far Europe has not gone through great national crises, with the proletarian masses taking an independent part in them. When such crises do set in, mass strikes in Europe will be even more powerful than they were in Russia in 1905. What was the ratio of economic to political strikes in that period? Government statistics give the following answer. In 1905, there were 1,439,000 strikers participating in economic strikes and 1,424,000 participating in political strikes. In 1906, 458,000 participating in economic strikes and 650,000 in political strikes, and in 1907, 200,000 in economic strikes and 540 in political strikes. This shows the close and inseparable connection between the two kinds of strike. When the movement was at its highest, 1905, the economic basis of the struggle was the broadest. In that year, the political strike rested on the firm and solid basis of economic strikes. the number of economic strikers was greater than that of political strikers. We see that as the movement declined in 1906 and 1907, the economic basis contracted. The number of economic strikes dropped to 40% of the total number of strikers in 1906 and to 30% in 1907. Consequently, the economic and the political strikes support each other, each being a source of strength for the other. Unless these forms of strike are closely interlinked, a really wide mass movement, moreover a movement of national significance, is impossible. When the movement is in its early stage, the economic strike often has the effect of awakening and stirring up the backward, of making the movement a general one, of raising it to a higher plane. In the first quarter of 1905, for instance, economic strikes noticeably predominated over political strikes, the number of strikers being 604,000 in the former case, and only 206,000 in the latter. In the last quarter of 1905, however, the ratio was reversed. 430,000 workers took part in economic strikes and 847,000 in political strikes. This means that in the early stage of the movement, many workers put the economic struggle first, while at the height of the movement, it was the other way around. But all the time, there was a connection between the economic and the political strike. Without such a connection, we repeat, it is impossible to have a really great movement, one that achieves great aims. Let's read that again. But all the time, there was a connection between the economic and the political strike. Without such a connection, we repeat, it is impossible to have a really great movement, one that achieves great aims. For example, ending capitalism. Continuing. In a political strike, the working class comes forward as the advanced class of the whole people. In such cases, the proletariat plays not merely the role of one of the classes of bourgeois society, but the role of guide, vanguard, leader. The political ideas manifested in the movement involve the whole people, i.e. they concern the basic, most profound conditions of the political life of the whole country. This character of the political strike, as has been noted by all scientific investigators of the period 1905 to 1907, brought into the movement all the classes, and particularly, of course, the widest, most numerous, and most democratic sections of the population, peasantry, and so forth. On the other hand, the mass of the working people will never agree to conceive of a general progress of the country without economic demands, without an immediate and direct improvement in their condition. The masses are drawn into the movement, participate vigorously in it, value it highly, and display heroism, self-sacrifice, perseverance, and devotion to the great cause only if it makes for improving the economic condition of those who work. Nor can it be otherwise, for the living conditions of the workers in, quote, ordinary times are incredibly hard. As it strives to improve its living conditions, the working class also progresses morally, intellectually, and politically, becomes more capable of achieving its great emancipatory aims. The strike statistics published by the Ministry of Commerce and Industry fully bear out this tremendous significance of the economic struggle of the workers in the period of a general revival. The stronger the onslaught of the workers, the greater their achievements in improving their standard of living. The sympathy of society and better conditions of life are both results of a high degree of development of the struggle. Whereas the liberals and the liquidators tell the workers, quote, you are strong when you have the sympathy of society, the Marxist tells the workers something different, namely, you have the sympathy of society when you are strong. What we mean by society in this case is all the various democratic sections of the population, the petty bourgeoisie, the peasants, and the intellectuals, who are in close touch with the life of the workers, office employees, etc. The strike movement was strongest in 1905, and what was the result? We see that in that year, the workers achieved the greatest improvements in their condition. Government statistics show that in 1905, only 29 out of every 100 strikers stopped their fight without having gained anything, i.e. were completely defeated. In the previous 10 years, 1895 to 1904, as many as 52 strikers out of 100 stopped fighting without having gained anything. It follows that the large scale of the struggle contributed immensely to its success, almost doubling it. When the movement began to decline, the success of the struggle began to diminish accordingly. In 1906, 33 strikers out of 100 stopped fighting without having gained anything or having been defeated. In 1907, the figure was 58, and in 1908 as high as 69 out of 100. Thus, the scientific statistical data over a number of years fully confirmed the personal experience and observations of every class-conscious worker as regards the necessity of combining the economic and the political strike, and the inevitability of this combination in a really broad movement of the whole people. The present strike wave likewise fully confirms this conclusion. In 1911, the number of strikers was double that in 1910, 100,000 against 50,000. But even so, their number was extremely small. Purely economic strikes remained a relatively narrow cause. They did not assume national significance, in other words. On the other hand, today it is obvious to one and all that the strike movement following the well-known events of last April had precisely this significance. So there is a footnote here. Unfortunately, it's missing. However, Lenin may be referring to the Lenin massacre of April 1912, when gold miners went on strike to protest really bad conditions, and Russian troops were sent in to shoot at them, and some 260 striking workers were killed. Continuing, it is therefore highly important to rebuff from the outset the attempts of the liberals and liberal labor politicians, liquidators, to distort the character of the movement. Mr. Severyanin, a liberal, contributed to Russkiya Vedomosti, an article against, quote, admixing economic or, quote, any other demands to the May Day strike, and the cadet Rek sympathetically reprinted in the main passages of the article, quote, more often than not, writes the liberal gentleman, quote, it is unreasonable to link such strikes with May Day. Indeed, it would be rather strange to do so. We are celebrating the International Workers' Holiday, and we use the occasion to demand a 10% rise for calico of such and such grades, unquote, quoting from Rec number 132. There's a footnote there. Russkiya Vedomosti, or the Russian Recorder, was a newspaper published in Moscow from 1963 onwards by moderately liberal intellectuals. Between the 1880s and 1890s, contributors to it included writers of the Democratic camp, P.G. Korolenko, M.Y. Saltykov, Shchedrin, O.I. Uspensky, and others, and it also published articles by liberal narodniks, populists. In 1905, it became an organ of the right wing of the Cadet Party, the bourgeois party. Lenin pointed out that the newspaper, quote, provided a unique combination of right cadetism and narodnik overtones. In 1918, it was closed down, along with other counter-revolutionary newspapers. Back to the text. What is quite clear to the workers seems, quote, strange to the liberal. Only the defenders of the bourgeoisie and its excessive profits can sneer at the demand for a, quote, rise. But the workers know that it is the widespread character of the demand for a rise. It is the comprehensive character of a strike that has the greatest power to attract a multitude of new participants, to ensure the strength of the onslaught and the sympathy of society, and to guarantee both the successes of the workers and the national significance of their movement. That is why it is necessary to fight with determination against the liberal distortion preached by Mr. Severyanin, Russkiya Vedomosti, and Rek, and to warn the workers in every way against this kind of sorry advisors. Mr. V. Yejov, a liquidator, writing in the very first issue of the liquidationist Nevsky Golos, offers a similar purely liberal distortion, although he approaches the question from a somewhat different angle. Quick footnote, Nevsky Golos, or Neva Voice, was a legal newspaper of the Menshevik liquidators published in St. Petersburg from May to August 1912. Continuing, he dwells in particular on the strikes provoked by the May Day fines, correctly pointing out that the workers are not sufficiently organized. The author draws from his correct statement conclusions that are quite wrong and most harmful to the workers. Mr. Yejov sees a lack of organization in the fact that while in one factory the workers struck merely in protest, in another they added economic demands, etc. Actually, however, this variety of forms of strike does not in itself indicate any lack of organization at all. It is ridiculous to imagine that organization necessarily means uniformity. Lack of organization is not at all to be found where Mr. Yejov looks for it. But his conclusion is still worse. Quote, owing to this, i.e. owing to the variety of the strikes and to the different forms of the combination of economics and politics, the principle involved in the protest, after all it was not over a few kopecks that the strike was called, became obscured in a considerable number of cases, being complicated by economic demands. Unquote. This This is a truly outrageous, thoroughly false, and thoroughly liberal argument. To think that the demand, quote, for a few kopecks is capable of, quote, obscuring the principle involved in the protest means sinking to the level of a cadet. On the contrary, Mr. Yezhov, the demand for, quote, a few kopecks deserves full recognition, not a sneer. On the contrary, Mr. Yezhov, that demand, far from, quote, obscuring, quote, the principle involved in the protest, emphasizes it. Firstly, the question of a higher standard of living is also a question of principle and a most important one. Secondly, whoever protests, not against one, but against two, three, etc., manifestations of oppression, does not thereby weaken their protest, but strengthens it. Every worker will indignantly reject Mr. Yezhov's outrageous liberal distortion of the matter. In the case of Mr. Yezhov, it is by no means a slip of the pen. He goes on to say even more outrageous things. Quote, their own experience should have suggested to the workers that it was inadvisable to complicate their protest by economic demands, just as it is inadvisable to complicate an ordinary strike by a demand involving a principle, unquote. This is untrue, 1,000 times untrue. The Nevsky Golos has disgraced itself by printing such stuff. What Mr. Yezhov thinks inadvisable is perfectly advisable. Both each worker's own experience and the experience of a very large number of Russian workers in the recent past testify to the reverse of what Mr. Yezhov preaches. Only liberals can object to, quote, complicating even the most, quote, ordinary strike by, quote, demands involving principles. That is the first point. Secondly, our liquidator is sorely mistaken in measuring the present movement with the yardstick of a, quote, ordinary strike. And Mr. Yezhov is wasting his time in trying to cover up his liberal contraband with someone else's flag, in confusing the question of combining the economic and the political strike with the question of preparations for the one or the other. Of course, it is most desirable to make preparations and to be prepared, and to do this as thoroughly, concertedly, unitedly, intelligently, and firmly as possible. That is beyond dispute. But contrary to what Mr. Yezhov says, it is necessary to make preparations precisely for a combination of the two kinds of strike. Quote, a period of economic strikes is ahead of us, writes Mr. Yezhov. Quote, it would be an irreparable mistake to allow them both to become intertwined with political actions of the workers. Such combination would have a harmful effect on both the economic and the political struggle of the workers, unquote. One could hardly go to greater lengths. These words show in the clearest possible way that the liquidator has sunk to the level of an ordinary liberal. Every sentence contains an error. We must convert every sentence into its direct opposite to get at the truth. It is not true that a period of economic strikes is ahead of us. Quite the reverse. What we have ahead of us is a period of something more than just economic strikes. We are facing a period of political strikes. The facts, Mr. Yezhov, are stronger than your liberal distortions. If you could look at the statistical cards dealing with strikes, which are filed in the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, you would see that even these government statistics fully refute you. It is not true that intertwining would be a mistake, quite the reverse. It would be an irreparable mistake if the workers failed to understand the great singularity, the great significance, the great necessity, and the great fundamental importance of precisely such intertwining. Fortunately, however, the workers understand this perfectly. They brush aside with contempt the preaching of liberal labor politicians. Lastly, it is not true that such intertwining, quote, would have a harmful effect on both forms. Quite the reverse. It benefits both. It strengthens both. Mr. Yezhov lectures some, quote, hotheads, whom he seems to have discovered. Listen to this, quote, it is necessary to give organizational form to the sentiments of the workers, unquote. This is gospel truth. Quote, it is necessary to increase propaganda for trade unions, to recruit new members for them, unquote. Quite true, but, Mr. Yezhov, it is impermissible to reduce organizational form to the trade unions alone. Remember this, Mr. Liquidator. Quote, this is all the more necessary since there are many hotheads among the workers nowadays who are carried away by the mass movement and speak at meetings against unions, alleging them to be useless and unnecessary, unquote. This is a liberal slur on the workers. It is not against unions that the workers, who have been and always will be a thorn in the side of the liquidators, have been coming out. No, the workers have been coming out against the attempt to reduce the organizational form to, quote, trade unions alone, an attempt which is so evident from Mr. Yezhov's preceding sentence. The workers have been coming out not, quote, against unions, but against the liberal distortion of the nature of the struggle they are waging, a distortion which pervades the whole of Mr. Yezhov's article. The Russian workers have become sufficiently mature politically to realize the great significance of their movement for the whole people. They are sufficiently mature to see how very false and paltry liberal labor policy is, and they will always brush it aside with contempt. And that is the end of the audiobook. So, what do you think? Leave a question or comment below. We'll continue the discussion there as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons whose name...
We'll be back again tomorrow at the same time. Please like, share, and subscribe.